Chapter 1160 Improving City of Silver, at the top of the spire. After waiting for a long time, Derek still didn't receive a response from Mr. Fool. This made him panic a little. He didn't understand what this meant, nor did he know how to deal with it. Mr. Fool is in a state where he can't respond to his prayers? Yes, he informed us 2 days ago that the gathering next week would be cancelled. This should be a sign. Having recalled what happened previously, Derek barely managed to calm his anxiety and nervousness. He couldn't be blamed for having such a huge reaction, because the City of Silver's textbooks recorded similar situations. The creator who normally responded to his believers suddenly stopped responding and forsook this land. After a few seconds of silence, Derek stood up and returned to the room where the chief was. He said to Colin Iliad, "We have to wait a few more days." Wait? Demon Hunter Colin repeated the keyword as he frowned slightly. From his point of view, this was an unusual matter, seemingly symbolizing a bad development. Derek resisted his instinctive reaction of scratching the back of his head, and he nodded with some difficulty. Yes. The grizzled Colin Iliad stared at him for a few seconds before nodding slowly. All right, head back first. Backlund East Borough, inside a 2-bedroom rental apartment. Furs, who was wrapped in thick clothes, paced around the warm stove, her face full of doubt. Finally, she turned her head and looked at Zio. Why hasn't Mr. World replied? Perhaps he's preoccupied with something. Zio explained the reason she had long considered. Perhaps it's because it's not convenient for Mr. Fool to pass on your prayers. He has temporarily paused the gathering. Furs nodded thoughtfully and said, Mr. Fool informed us that the gathering will be temporarily paused next week. It was only decided in the middle of the week. Is this related to George III? Recalling Mr. World's investigations all this time, Zio acknowledged and said, very likely. In the forsaken land of the gods, in the dead silent city. Dressed in a classic black mage's robe, Amon led Klein into a relatively complete cathedral. Segmented stone pillars lay tilted, and dark red weeds grew out from their cracks, wrapping around the avian sculptures. With the animal hide lantern in hand, Klein surveyed the area and confirmed that the residents of this city weren't truly dead. There were still a few survivors left. He had no idea what method they had used to transform into monsters of the deep darkness. They were hiding from the faint yellow light, surrounding a cathedral in a place that couldn't be seen. They wanted to attack the 2 ordinary-looking humans, Klein and Amon. The reason why Klein was able to confirm that these monsters were originally residents of this city was because their spirit body threads had a certain abnormality. Some were grayish-white, some were distorted, and some were sticky. They were completely different from the monsters elsewhere. They greatly resembled the corpses inside the coffins. I don't know what kind of despair and mental breakdowns will make the remaining humans choose such a path. Perhaps the deepest sense of despair was that they couldn't see hope on a daily basis while the situation around them worsened. With a sigh, he made use of this opportunity to adjust his mentality. He was experiencing various instances of hope surfacing, only to be met with despair time and time again. The monocled Amon walked to the edge of the light and walked all the way into the deepest part of the cathedral. Klein followed behind and saw a door covered in pale white light. This city is actually split into 2 parts, light and darkness. They're using certain abilities of the apprentice pathway to hide a portion of the area. They have to use a specific door to enter, Amon said as he pointed ahead. A secret sorcerer's powers? With some realization, Klein nodded, indicating that he knew what was going on. Amon then said, behind this door is the dark side of the city. I can use it to connect to a similar region far away. We can directly arrive there and shorten our journey. As expected of the incarnation of loopholes. Klein watched as Amon stretched out his left hand and pressed down on the door formed from pale white light. The light began to ripple as it rapidly spread outwards, becoming more and more intense. At that moment, a deformed monster hiding in the depths of the darkness while spying on the cathedral suddenly trembled, becoming Klein's marionette. 20 or 30 seconds ago, Klein had already completed the process of obtaining initial control over it and deepened his influence. However, he waited until now before he completely converted it. Right on the heels of that, Klein and the marionette reached out their hands at the same time. They took advantage of the opportunity when Amon changed the door, and they grabbed something. In his hand was something in the shape of a full moon, and was embedded with scarlet gemstones, the scarlet lunar corona. In his marionette's hand was an ancient, brass-colored master key. At the same time, they opened their mouths and made a bang sound. They used air cannons to push the scarlet lunar corona and the master key to the door of light. These two items combined could make one hear Mr. Doors pleas for help. This also meant that Mr. Doors' powers could enter the real world to a limited extent. And this was the controller of all doors. He was one of the existences who was most unwilling to see Amon become an error or control Sapphira Castle. Klein didn't expect that the sealed Mr. Door could really hurt Amon. He only hoped that he could use this opportunity to interfere with the Angel of Time and create a good enough opportunity for himself. Of course, if Mr. Door could cause any abnormal changes to the door, magnifying or distorting the loopholes created by Amon, thus, affecting the King of Angels of the Marauder pathway and teleporting him far away, Klein would definitely sincerely thank Mr. Door for a week. After his previous attempts, Klein realized his greatest disadvantage. It wasn't that he was one sequence short and had a qualitative gap in power level. Instead, he had lost the initiative and couldn't make proper preparations. Every time he began preparing, he would be interrupted or foiled by Amon. For a veteran magician, unprepared performances were often synonymous with failure. If he could make preparations in advance, he could quietly summon Mr. Azek's, Rionette Tinker's, and Snake of Fate Will Osepton's historical projections. Against a sequence too, even if there was no way to deal with him, it would definitely create a very good opportunity to escape. At that moment, the scarlet lunar corona and ancient-looking master key whistled through the air and arrived at the door of light. The white light that formed the illusory door distorted and devoured the two items. It was dyed crimson as it collapsed into a whirlpool. It was as though the bottom of the vortex was invisible, like a gigantic eye. Just as Amon was about to turn around, he made a slight pause as if he had heard an old friend's shout. However, this pause disappeared instantly, as though it had never appeared. With Amon's gaze directed at Klein, the latter instantly lost 6 Beyonder powers. This included the control of spirit body threads, the summoning of historical void projections, paper figurine substitutes, flame controlling, underwater breathing, and bones softening. Of course, losing these 6 Beyonder powers for a marionette didn't affect Klein's subsequent operations. The indiscernible pause from before had allowed Klein to switch places with his marionette in time. He had already arrived deep in the darkness outside the cathedral. The deformed monsters around him trembled and turned into his marionettes. For targets such as these that weren't even sequence 5, it took only 2 or 3 seconds for Klein to transform them into marionettes. And by the time he summoned the scarlet lunar corona, he had already begun doing similar actions. As he enjoyed the darkness without any scruples, he attempted to transform into a concealed state or successfully commit suicide. At the same time, he reached out with his marionettes to grab at the fog interwoven with history. This time, he split the marionette into 3 groups, summoning Rionette Tinker, Mr. Azek, and Snake of Fate Will Osepton, respectively. He didn't want to follow his past mistakes, where he had managed to succeed with great difficulty only to have them taken away by Amon. With such arrangements, he might be left with 1 or 2. Of course, the premise was that Amon was unable to steal multiple historical void projections at once. This was something that Klein needed to confirm. Klein retracted his hand, but he didn't grab anything. All the marionettes who summoned the Snake of Fate failed. Among the scholars of your groups who summoned the Death Consul and Rionette Tinker, 2 of them had their arms tense up slightly. Klein was delighted as he suddenly felt that this attempt could end up turning into a real escape attempt. At this moment, the crystal monocle that Amon wore emitted a terrifying light. The entire city, including the surrounding rivers, hills, and wilderness, were all filled with pure, scorching sunlight. Day had once again descended upon this land after bidding farewell to it for thousands of years. Amon had stolen the day from the ruins of the Battle of Gods. In the face of such a day, not only did Klein feel like his body was about to melt, but he also heard familiar and crazy ravings in his ears. They were like steel needles that pierced through every worm of spirit. This caused his mind to be filled with immense pain. His marionette summoning attempts had failed while on the brink of success. The day in the battlefield of the gods contained the true creator's ravings. The deformed monsters that were hiding deep in the darkness, which were the few survivors of the city, seemed to temporarily regain their senses. They stared blankly at the day, and couldn't help but narrow their eyes. Then, they wildly charged towards the source of that day, melting one by one into dust. Far away in the City of Silver's afternoon town campsite, the guards at the stronghold also noticed that there was a light coming from the northeast. It was different from lightning, just like the scene of the sun rising from the legends. This scene only lasted for a few seconds before it shattered and the sky returned to its dark state. As soon as he recovered from the ravings, Klein saw the pointed-hatted Amon standing in front of him. This angel of time nudged his monocle and smiled. Well done. Chapter 1161 Countdown. Well done. Faced with Amon's praise, Klein forced a smile and politely replied, "Thank you." To be honest, he preferred to hear curses rather than praise, as that meant that he was close to succeeding. Of course, Klein suspected that even if he managed to escape, Amon wouldn't be flustered and exasperated. Based on the character displayed by this god of mischief, it was very likely that he found it interesting and exciting while also inevitably feeling a little depressed and disappointed to the point of being eager for the next round. It's a huge improvement to be able to think of using door to disrupt me. Amon smiled indifferently. But don't you think that I'd be in a relatively more vigilant state while door opening? And that it's actually not that easy to be affected by an accident? After some thought, Klein answered seriously, "That's what I thought in the beginning, but later on, I felt that you should be able to grasp my state of mind, believing that I wouldn't dare to act when you opened the door. When that happens, making an attempt might work wonders. Doing it when others believe that you wouldn't do it was also a strategy." In his previous life, Klein had come into contact with games that had such a higher level of thinking that made his head spin. What if I thought of this level as well? Amon said with a smile as he used his knuckle to nudge the bottom of his monocle. At the same time, the remaining marionettes, which were still alive, took out crystal monocles out of thin air and wore them on their right eye. All of them cast their gazes at Klein. This left Klein's scalp tingling. He discovered that the connection between the marionettes and himself had instantly been severed. Although you've improved, failure still demands some level of punishment. With a smile, Amon turned around and walked towards the cathedral. As he took a step forward, the marionettes revealed smiles one after another as they collapsed to the ground stiffly. This caused Klein's soul to be torn apart again and again as the blood vessels on his forehead visibly bulged. As he endured the pain, he stood rooted to the ground and calmed down after a long while. During this process, although he had always been in the depths of the darkness, he didn't suffer any attacks from the terrifying monsters, nor did he turn into a concealed state. When did Amon steal the concealment powers in this city? If I had tried to commit suicide, I definitely would have had the thought stolen from me. My preparations still aren't enough. I don't have enough confidence when dealing with Amon, having not considered the things he might have stolen into consideration. I really didn't expect him to release the day that he stole from the ruins of the battlefield of gods. Regarding what else he stole in the past, or whatever he has on him, I have no idea. I can't make targeted preparations. That monocle is some sort of vessel used to store stolen items? Or is it part of Amon to begin with? So every time he parasitizes someone, a monocle will be taken out. Klein rubbed his temples and walked into the cathedral. Looking at Amon before the door of light, he asked, seemingly casual, "Why do you have so many monocles? Where do you usually place them?" Amon stroked the monocle on his right eye and smiled indifferently. Why don't you ask me why every avatar of mine has eyes? And where do I usually place them? I understand. Klein nodded in enlightenment. Amon cast his gaze back to the door of light that had yet to calm down from the rippling. He casually said, I have the nagging feeling that this operation of yours is a major preparation piece, and not an attempt. What cheap trick did you pull off during that process? After some deliberation, Klein replied with a smile, guess. I do have some guesses. Do you think I've guessed it correctly? Amon asked with interest as he pinched the edge of his monocle. Perhaps, or perhaps not. Klein didn't give a clear answer as he cooperatively walked to Amon's side. He saw him reach out again and press down on the pale white door of light. Above the door of light, ripples appeared once again as they became more intense and exaggerated. After about 10 seconds, the ripples spread the surroundings, causing the door of light to expand twice in size. Amon glanced at Klein, gesturing for him to take a step forward. Klein instinctively turned his head and looked around the cathedral. Beyonder characteristics left behind by the mutated monsters were shimmering outside the area that the lantern had lit up. They weren't all Beyonders when they were alive. After those ordinary people turned into monsters, a large part of the power came from the darkness and degeneration. The powers didn't belong to them, so no characteristics were purged. I almost forgot. After taking a look together with Klein, Amon suddenly shook his head and smiled. Just as he finished his sentence, a bunch of Beyonder characteristics floated up and entered his body. They merged with him, leaving only a small portion behind. Most of the people who chose to transform into monsters are of the apprentice pathway, Beyonders, and their family members who can enter the city's dark side, Amon said casually as he retracted his gaze. Even if it's a similar pathway's Beyonder characteristic, it would be problematic if it's directly eaten, right? Shouldn't it only be possible to jump to a higher level of a neighboring pathway? It also allows the accommodation of lower sequences. Seeing this, Klein was a little stunned as he asked curiously, won't this accumulate madness? This wasn't just a matter of accumulating madness. Klein suspected that if he did it himself, there was a high chance that he would go crazy. Others will, Amon said with a smile, but not me. A true bug. Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Then, the distance between him and the door of light disappeared. Subconsciously, he forgot about the remaining death pathway's Beyonder characteristics, and he entered the mutated door of light with Amon. Endless darkness and squirming lines of light were mixed together, giving rise to the feeling of a sudden descent. About 10 seconds later, he discovered that he and Amon had appeared on a square. The dim yellow light of the animal hide lantern seemed to be stopped by an invisible force, causing it to only illuminate half the square. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the surroundings. With the help of the lightning, Klein saw several incomplete statues erected around the square. They either had their hands tied to their backs, had their bodies entangled with the thorny roses, or looked like mummies. They gave off the feeling of being restrained. This city first believed in the mutant king. Like a qualified tour guide, Amon introduced the situation of each scenic site to Klein. They're very interesting. They're usually restrained and quiet, just like ascetics. However, once they encounter prey, or in special moments in time, they will release a bloodthirsty desire to kill. You can imagine that on the night of the full moon, this is a city where werewolves roam. From the looks of it, the mutants originally had the concept of temperance. Later on, it was led astray by the mother tree of desire. Using the new round of lightning, Klein took a few more looks and asked thoughtfully, the mutant king's image is close to that of a mummy? No. Although he is an ugly and twisted man, he likes to entangle himself with thorny roses. Amon scoffed. Klein took the opportunity to ask, what kind of idols will your believers worship? In mysticism, your symbol is a clock and a worm of time? Amon scratched his chin and said, in theory, my believers are all me. I don't need to trouble myself with building an idol. My believers are all me. Thankfully, I have a blessed like Danitz now. Klein suddenly realized that he was quite similar to Amon in certain aspects. Of course, when I say, my believer is myself, it's a funny story. When Amon says that, my believers are all me, it becomes a horror novel. The difference in style is quite huge. Klein finally mocked himself. As Amon walked forward, he continued, however, in my father's era, quite a number of people believed in me. Some of them set off with the name Angel of Time, using the emblem of the clock to construct my idol. Some of them used the title of God of Mischief and used a crow covered in mysterious patterns as my image, while others combined the two together. Having said that, the monocled Amon suddenly turned his head and glanced at Klein before curling his lips. We're less than 3 days away from our final destination. That is to say, I only have 3 days left. Klein nearly drew in a cold breath of air. The pressure increased rapidly, making him feel as though his nerves were being crushed. He had yet to determine the true purpose behind this game Amon made, nor did he discover any traces of what he was being driven to do. This meant that he was unable to grasp the key, and he was unable to find a real opportunity to escape. The performance of Amon's avatar made him understand that he might not even be able to last 10 seconds before him. As his thoughts raced, Klein fell silent. Following that, he walked out of the square covered in ruins. There were few pedestrians on the streets as they came and went in a hurry. In Pritz Harbor, where many houses were covered in bum marks, the chestnut-haired Queen Mystic placed a newspaper on the table. The first page of the Tussock Times was about the king's assassination. It also claimed that the assassin came from Fasak or Intis. This isn't stopping the disaster, nor is it worsening the disaster, Bernadette muttered to herself with a serious expression. She pondered for a moment, picked up the cloth on the table, and wrapped it up. Then, she released her fingers and allowed it to relax. This time, the coffee cups, pens, newspapers, and other items in the tablecloth disappeared. What appeared were ritual items like silver-made candles. Following that, Bernadette held a ritual and summoned Gehrman Sparrow's messenger. As a partner, she felt that she needed to ask about the other party's situation and see if there was anything else she needed to help with. The moment the ritual ended, 4 blonde, red-eyed heads walked out of the burgeoning candle flame. Dressed in a dark and complicated long dress, Rionette Tinker's neck was empty. Bernadette's eyelids twitched indecibly before she picked up the letter and gold coin that she had prepared earlier and handed it to the messenger. One of Rionette Tinker's heads bit on the letter and gold coin while the other head sized up Queen Mystic for a few seconds. She shifted her gaze back and walked into the void. However, just as Bernadette was about to put away the tablecloth, Miss Messenger suddenly appeared again. One of the 2 heads with blonde hair and red eyes spoke one after another. He has disappeared. Chapter 1162 Prophecy Gehrman Sparrow has gone missing. Bernadette had a vague sense of foreboding when the abnormally terrifying messenger returned. She had roughly figured out what had happened. Therefore, after hearing the other party's response, her expression sank slightly. There was no obvious reaction. Queen Mystic's blue eyes, which resembled a condensing sea, instantly turned darker. They temporarily lost focus, as though she was looking at a torrent of fate through Rionette Tinker. 2 to 3 seconds later, Bernadette suddenly closed her eyes, as if a blinding light had appeared in front of her. Blood-red liquid trickled from the corner of her eyes, accentuating her pale face. With her eyes tightly shut, Bernadette said in a slightly ethereal voice, Gehrman Sparrow is in grave danger. Darkness is devouring the light, leaving behind only a sliver of hope. This was a prophecy. The sequence 3 of the mystery prior pathway was clairvoyant. The 4 heads held by Rionette Tinker spoke one after another. What does darkness symbolize? Bernadette maintained her composure and said, desolation, aberration, apocalypse, negativity, error. Rionette Tinker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, didn't let the head in her hand speak any further. Throwing down the letter and gold coin, she turned and walked into the void, disappearing into the room. Queen Mystic Bernadette stood rooted to the ground for a few seconds without moving. Finally, she opened her eyes again. Her blue eyes were hazy and lifeless, as though she needed more time to restore her eyesight. Bernadette thought for a moment and reached out her right hand. The tablecloth was stowed away before being spread open once again. The ritual items were replaced with a fountain pen, paper, and ink bottle. The fountain pen suddenly leaped up, as if it was held by an invisible sprite. It quickly wrote down the matter of Gehrman Sparrow's disappearance onto the paper. In the captain's cabin of the future. Despite looking at the fried mushrooms on her plate and taking in the fragrance of the fat, Katlia didn't pick up her cutlery for a long time. Suddenly, her spiritual perception was triggered. She turned her head to look at the spot where the brass sextant was placed, and she realized that a letter had appeared there at some point in time. Katlia immediately revealed a smile as she reached out to pick up the letter and eagerly began reading it. Gradually, she frowned. Gehrman Sparrow has gone missing, Katlia repeated the key point of the letter in a low voice. She acutely felt that this matter was somewhat serious. She easily understood the meaning behind Queen Mystic's letter. Without any hesitation, she bowed her head, clasped her hands, and recited an honorific name in ancient Hermes, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. Above the gray fog, the crimson star representing the hermit came alive. It began expanding and contracting, spreading out ripples of prayers. They intertwined with the ripples created by the two crimson stars that corresponded to the magician and the sun. They surged towards the ancient and majestic palace, like tidal waves. Someone is praying to Mr. Fool again. The echoes are getting even stronger, and the sound is becoming more clear. I can hear it clearly, and the image is also clearer. This prayer seems to be from Ma'am Hermit. Only she likes to wear ancient warlock robes. Queen Mystic discovered that something has happened to Gehrman Sparrow. Although I was worried that I would die this time and needed a certain amount of time to revive, I had already hinted to the members of the Tarot Club that I might cancel the gathering next week, but that was just a hint. It wasn't a formal notice, nor was it clear enough. When Monday comes, they'll definitely panic, pray, and try to make contact, only to discover that Mr. Fool has also disappeared. No, he has run off with the world. Klein used a deprecating comment to ease his feelings. He glanced at Amon, who was walking beside him. Without a word, he lifted the lantern in his hand and said, "It should have been extinguished long ago." Wearing a pointed hat and black mage robe, Amon nodded slightly and said, "I left it in a magical state. It can maintain its light for a week without needing any fuel." Klein thought for a moment and asked, "Is this the deceiving of natural laws?" Amon turned his head and used his monocled right eye to look at Klein for a second before smiling. Smart. The Error Pathways Sequence 3 is a more profound version of Swindler, known as a mentor of deceit. It's about the same as my guess. However, it isn't only the error pathway that can do such a thing. The Black Emperor can use distortion and exploit powers to achieve that. In his mind, Klein began comparing the differences between the Marauder and the Lawyer pathway. At this moment, Amon stroked his chin and asked with interest, "There are less than 3 days left. If you don't think of a way to escape, it will be too late. Do you plan on making a new attempt tomorrow? Make a guess." Klein forced a smile as he answered in the same rhetoric manner that Amon was best at using. To be honest, he didn't believe that the effects would be better given more attempts. On the one hand, frequent attempts were indeed able to test the limits of Amon's powers. By expending the items that he had previously stolen, Klein could establish a good foundation for the final battle. But on the other hand, he would also expose his trump cards. After all, he was in a passive state and had no chance to prepare. To force Amon to showcase more of the means available to him, it required him to use the few trump cards he had. If his countermeasures were all figured out by Amon after his repeated attempts, he wouldn't have any chance of escaping. An attempt to escape was a double-edged sword. If one wasn't careful, one would cut oneself. It was precisely because of this that Klein didn't blindly take action, and carefully made plans in his heart. As he spoke, he walked out of the city that originally worshipped the mutant king and later believed in the ancient sun god. There were only white bones and several stone structures that had been weathered by the elements here that showcased its former prosperity. Outside the city, there was an endless wilderness that couldn't be seen in the lightning. At 7 Pinster Street, Leonard sat on a sofa. He placed his feet on the coffee table and leisurely flipped through the day's newspaper. Yesterday, George III's death had brought them copious amounts of work. He had spent the entire night on duty, and he received 5 hours of rest today. After sleeping for 2 hours, Leonard woke up in high spirits, attempting to understand the current situation from the normal media. In fact, as the captain of a Red Gloves team, he knew more than the reporters about certain aspects. For example, in the outskirts of Backlund, where the Tudor ruin was located, it had collapsed into a rather large lake. It had nearly affected Dwayne Dantes's Mager Manor. Another was the death of George III, who had self-destructed at the square, but wasn't the actual person. The search for his corpse was to no avail, as though he had vanished into thin air that night. Of course, Leonard was extremely certain that George III was already dead. The eldest prince was about to inherit the title of Balam Emperor and Lone King. Back then, something had happened at Sapphira Castle. This matter definitely has something to do with Mr. Fool. Klein had long warned us about George III. The reactions of the 3 churches were very strange. Even the Church of the Lord of Storms, which is most prone to acting rash, wasn't too angry. As Leonard flipped through the newspaper, his thoughts wandered casually. At this moment, his mind was filled with the slightly aged voice of Palaz Zoroast. Gehrman Sparrow's messenger is here. Leonard suddenly looked up and saw the angel-level messenger airing a dark and complicated long dress appear in front of him. The 4 blonde, red-eyed heads held by Rionette Tinker spoke one after another. Gehrman Sparrow has encountered extreme danger. He has gone missing. Klein has encountered danger and disappeared. Leonard immediately retracted his legs and stood up. Without waiting for the reminder provided by Palaz Zoroast, his spiritual perception stirred as he blurted out, "Is it related to the death of George III?" Yes, he destroyed the apotheosis ritual of George III. The 8 red eyes on Rionette Tinker's 4 heads looked at Leonard. Apotheosis ritual? Although Leonard was anxious, he was still shocked by the phrase. For someone to hold an apotheosis ritual, one had to be a sequence 1 angel at the very least. Yet, Klein was able to directly participate in something at that level. Mr. Fool's plan? Leonard's green eyes glimmered slightly. Relying on his relatively rich experience, he pointedly asked, "What happened to Klein the last time you saw him?" The 4 blonde, red-eyed heads of Rionette Tinker shook and said, "Possibly, under Zeradal's pursuit." As Gehrman Sparrow's messenger, this ancient bane was able to sense that her employer had also left the Tudor ruins after escaping. And as for those who understood the means of a scholar of yore, they were undoubtedly high-sequence beyonders of the same pathway. Therefore, Zeradal would definitely be able to obstruct and pursue him. Zeradal? The leader of the secret order, the sequence 1 angel, Zeradal? As Leonard was worried about Klein, he felt fear and concern for the life of his former colleague. At that moment, a deep voice sounded in his mind, "Ask her what other clues she has." Leonard immediately did as he was asked. Rionette Tinker seemed to know that Leonard wasn't simple. She repeated Queen Mystic's prophecy word by word. After listening to what was said, Palaz Zoroast fell silent for a while before sighing. "Error. I think I know about your former colleague's current situation." Leonard subconsciously wanted to ask, but because there were outsiders around, he held back his urge. Palaz paused and continued, "The anomaly with Sapphira Castle attracted Zeradal. How could Amon not notice it? This should be related to the struggle for Sapphira Castle." Sapphira Castle. Leonard slowly took a deep breath and said to Rionette Tinker, "He might have fallen into the hands of Amon." After Miss Messenger's 4 heads nodded and turned to leave, Leonard immediately sat down and clasped his hands. Closing his eyes, he prayed. "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Chapter 1163. Approaching above the grey fog, the crimson star representing the star also burgeoned and contracted. The rippling light gradually overlapped with the other ripples created by the other 3 crimson stars, turning into a tidal wave that surged through the entire mysterious space, causing the space to vibrate slightly. After describing the matter related to Klein, Leonard ended his prayers and waited for Mr. Fool to respond. However, he still didn't receive any feedback after nearly 15 minutes. Mr. Fool has always been very responsive. Leonard couldn't help but mutter. After a few seconds of silence, Palaz Zoroast reminded with a slightly aged voice, "Recall what the fool said recently." Leonard thought carefully and slowly said, "In the middle of the week, he reminded us not to head into the woods in the northwestern outskirts of Backlund. Yes, he seemed to hint that the gathering might not be held as planned. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU, as expected." Palaz Zoroast let out a long sigh and said, the fool had predicted Amon's appearance to a certain extent. They might be fighting in different domains now. One of them wishes to hold on to Sapphira Castle, while the other wishes to become the new owner of Sapphira Castle. Your former colleague has unfortunately been embroiled in this matter. Mr. Fool had expected this? Is this a trap he laid for Amon? Leonard's green eyes lit up as he blurted out. Palaz spent a significant amount of time thinking as he spoke much slower. Perhaps that's the case. Perhaps it's because Amon exploited the trap and took the initiative. Don't underestimate a blasphemer, a powerful king of angels. According to what Leonard knew, Mr. Fool was either the owner of the Sapphira Castle who was slowly recovering, corresponding to some unknown deity in history, or he was the embodiment of Sphirot. Currently, he was unable to control his authority and strength very well, something that could be fixed with a further qualitative change. And regardless of the possibilities, Mr. Fool was still unable to reach the level of a true deity. He was likely on the same level as the King of Angels. Under such circumstances, it was rather normal that Mr. Fool and the terrifying blasphemer would undergo an intense battle. After all, that person was one of them, one of the strongest hidden existences beneath the deities. He was even more powerful than the hidden sage that was usually categorized as an evil god. Even deities were somewhat apprehensive towards him. Leonard couldn't help but tense up. He asked in a low voice worriedly, "Old man, do you have any way to provide any help? Isn't Amon your greatest enemy? Such help might be limited, but it should be able to pull Klein out of the maelstrom." Upon hearing that, Palaz Zoroast laughed and said with an obvious self-deprecating tone, "Aren't you expecting too much from me? Indeed, if Amon obtains Sapphira Castle, I'll definitely die at his hands. I might not be able to survive this winter. And if Sapphira Castle is left with the fool, I might have a chance of surviving in the future. But would an old man like me, who has just recovered to Sequence 2, have the ability to interfere with a battle at this level? Even if I were to use the yesterday once more charms, what can I do in the short time span of 2 to 3 seconds? Yes. At the critical moment, I might be able to help the fool warp the situation, but I don't even know where they are fighting. How can I seize the opportunity?" Leonard fell silent after hearing Old Man's long answer. He immediately bowed his head and raised his hands to press them against the sides of his head. He muttered to himself, "Don't tell me that I can only watch helplessly." Palaz sighed and said, "Be patient. All we can do now is be patient." The fool and Eve might, and some other deities and kings of angels seem to have some tacit understanding with each other. They might even be cooperating with one another. They will not allow Amon to take away Sapphira Castle. Wait patiently. Perhaps it won't take long for a window of opportunity to appear. Leonard straightened his body and leaned back. He took a deep breath and exhaled. "I understand." The Blue Avenger, which had been ordered by the Church of the Lord of Storms to attack the port and Phasation merchant ships near the waters of Sonia Island, was hiding somewhere outside the safe sea route. Alger Wilson stood behind the window of the captain's cabin, using his extremely distant vision to stare at the long coastline. To this newly advanced ocean songster's point of view, many captains who received similar missions were the cream of the crop of the mid-sequence beyonders. Their joint operation would definitely be able to effectively harm the traffic flow of Faysation waters. This also meant that an attack from Faysac would be reasonably fierce, with a high chance of a Sequence 4 demigod leading the attack. Of course, one couldn't eliminate the possibility of a Sequence 3 War Bishop or Silver Knight appearing. This was a dangerous development for Alger. He didn't wish to put himself in such danger. At the same time, his crew, colleagues, and partners would monitor each other, preventing anyone from deserting. If Alger were to skive and walk on the edge of danger, it wouldn't take long for him to consider killing most of the crew members and become a true pirate, or lose the Blue Avenger and return to Pasu Island for an internal probe. After this operation ends, the captains who could still survive wouldn't exceed a third. Alger calmly analyzed the situation and quickly came up with a plan to avoid danger. That was to participate in the operation, but not take center stage. Alger planned on using a surprise attack on the port while his brethren frenetically attacked the Faysation merchant and supply ships. This would bring the people on board his ship onto Sonia Island, allowing them to lay in ambush in a primeval forest. Occasionally, he would cause some minor disturbances to the port which were easily managed. This way, the Faysac demigods would definitely cast their gazes at the sea, and not towards him. At the same time, in the eyes of the crew, he would be a role model who was willing to take great risks to enter the enemy's borders. After thinking through all the details, Alger immediately gathered the crew and repeated his plans. Finally, he emphasized, "This will be very dangerous. Trust me, it's very, very dangerous. We won't be able to advance and retreat like we can at sea. We might be surrounded by enemies at any time, but such an attack will definitely exceed the expectations of the Faysations, and it will give us the outcome we want. Are you willing to remain on the ship as cowards, or do you want to follow me into battle as a hero to show your devotion to the Lord?" The crew members felt their blood boiling as they rashly said, "Fuck the Faysations." Very good. Alger felt relieved as he struck his right fist on his left breast. "May the storm be with us. May the storm be with us," the sailor saluted and shouted. After making the necessary arrangements, Alger believed that he needed to borrow the unshadowed crucifix as soon as possible so as to purge the excess ocean songster's beyonder characteristic. Although he had exaggerated the danger of landing on the island, there was still a certain level of danger involved. Therefore, he wanted to quickly recover to his optimal condition. And he had long understood Mr. Fool's earlier hint. He felt that tonight or tomorrow morning, Mr. Fool would officially inform them that the gathering was to be cancelled. Of course, there were some ideas in the deepest depths of Alger's heart. He suspected that every time Mr. Fool cancelled the Tarot Club, something had happened to him. He wanted to use this prayer to test if this mighty existence was still normal. "No, I can't. Thou shalt not test God. This isn't a test. Mr. Fool didn't hint that I can't pray to him recently. Besides, borrowing the unshadowed crucifix is something I really need to do within the next few days." Alger paced back and forth, unable to make a decision. At this moment, he heard the sound of waves crashing. Through the additional type of vision provided by the ghost ship, he saw the water part as a huge fish-type creature appeared. The strange-looking giant fish opened its mouth and spat out a small metal ball that landed on the deck. Alger nodded and expressed his gratitude with his singing. This was a sea creature that the Church of the Lord of Storms had tamed. In this operation, it and its companions were the messengers between the various ships and the islands. Upon receiving his gratitude, the giant fish-like creature trembled. With a flick of its tail, it headed deep into the sea and swam into the distance. Alger looked at it silently for 2 seconds before summoning a gust of wind to bring the metal ball into the captain's cabin. He twisted open the metal ball and took out the piece of paper inside. Alger's eyes froze from a mere glance at it. "George III has been assassinated." Alger repeated the content with a heavy expression before recalling the World Gehrman Sparrow's reminder and Mr. Fool's hints. This time, he no longer hesitated. He locked the room and softly muttered the honorific name, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." These prayers are almost becoming a choral symphony. Mr. Hanged Man wants to borrow the unshadowed crucifix from little son? Leonard. Yes. These voices are stacked over one another, undulating in pitch and volume. It's making the surroundings tremble. Klein rubbed his temples, having a feeling that he had been struck by lightning from every direction. At this moment, he followed Amon deeper into the desolate moors and saw the grayish-yellow fog that blanketed the area. There were a few ravines, and in the deep, dark depths, there were plenty of things roaming. Compared to the quiet, lurking monsters from before, the ones here were rather special. The pointy-hatted Amon raised his hand to nudge his monocle and pointed ahead with a smile. Another half a day and we should be reaching our final destination. Half a day. It hasn't been a day yet. Didn't you say 3 days? Klein's pupils seemingly dilated. Amon smiled and said, I said not more than 3 days. 1 day is not more than 3 days, too. Upon saying that, the King of Angels paused and asked with piqued interest, Did I hamper your arrangements? Are you feeling more despair? Klein didn't answer as he suddenly reached out his hand and grabbed into the void beside him. Chapter 1164 Cheating. Although Klein had been a Beyonder for less than 2 years, his experience could be described as rich and exciting, even among Sequence 4 and Sequence 3 saints. The things he possessed or encountered before that could be summoned from the historical void, and the ones that were capable of quickly killing him didn't number many. Here, he chose the flaring sun charm that he had used in Tinjin City. He had already recited the incantation, injected his spirituality into it, and was about to activate the charms. Indeed, to a demigod of the seer pathway that meant bizarreness and change, it wasn't very effective against him. He mainly depended on the damage it did to his body, but Klein didn't dodge or defend himself. Instead, he released his body and mind to embrace the light of hope. Even at the level of a Sequence 3 scholar of yore, the defense of a seer pathway's Beyonder remained low. His offensive ability was also equally insufficient compared to his peers. This resulted in a sad fact: when Klein wanted to commit suicide, he didn't have any powers that could quickly kill himself. After all, it was impossible for him to control his spirit-body threads and transform himself into his marionette. This would result in logical contradictions. Towards the end of the process, he would lack the ability to continue making himself a marionette. And when he was searching for ways to kill himself through external means, he realized that, as long as he didn't use methods like marionette interchange, paper figurine substitutes, and historical void hiding, there were too many options that he could consider. The seer was such a powerful pathway that veered towards the extremes. Seeing that Klein was about to take out a flaring sun charm from the fog of history, along with having a strong desire to commit suicide, Amon only smiled. Without even raising his hand, he stole the entire idea, causing the crystal monocle to glow slightly. Klein immediately forgot what he was trying to do. But his actions didn't stop. His shocked reaction when he heard that they were only half a day away from the final destination was mostly faked. This was because he had always been wary of the god of deceit. He didn't trust anything that he said. There were too many interpretations of not more than 3 days, so Klein had long prepared for the worst. After hearing what Amon said, he immediately arranged the things he needed to do into a sequence. After having the idea of summoning the flaring sun charm to commit suicide, it was to summon that existence, summon this, that, and those existences. He made it cyclic, hoping that no matter how many thoughts Amon stole from him, he would still follow his original plan and perform the corresponding actions. Regarding this matter, back when he dealt with 0-08, he had been thinking about it above the gray fog. He had used the experience of treating the real him as a marionette and only following a predetermined set of actions. This helped him greatly. At that moment, although he didn't know what he was trying to do, to the point of not realizing that he had forgotten something, he knew very well what he would do next. The past wasn't important, but the present and future were key. Klein reached out his palm again and grabbed the void in front of him. His entire arm sank. However, when he retracted his right hand, nothing came out. At the same time, Amon raised his palm and gently swiped forward. He had stolen the historical void projection that Klein had summoned. A figure quickly appeared beside Amon. It was an elder dressed in a hooded black robe. His eyes were deep black, like a dark water surface, and the white beard around his mouth was long and dense. Zeradol. The leader of the secret order, the Sequence 1 angel, Zeradol. The existence that Klein had attempted to summon was actually Zeradol, and he had succeeded in one try. This was because he had made preparations in advance. Back in the city that the Phoenix believers had built, when Klein had split his marionettes into 3 groups, he was actually attempting to summon Zeradol from the historical void. Without a doubt, it was impossible to succeed at that time. However, as a scholar of yore, it would be a massive failure if one failed to notice that someone else was trying to summon their historical projection. As for Zeradol, he was definitely a senior, excellent, and experienced scholar of yore. After such a failed summoning, Klein had established a connection with Zeradol. This was the tacit understanding between scholars of yore. As for a miracle invoker, an attendant of mysteries, he was able to respond to his historical projection. It was just like how a scholar of yore had a 100% chance of success when borrowing strength from his past. In addition, a scholar of yore had no contractual connection with the historical void projection. They relied on the other party's lack of intelligence, or them having good relationships with them, to control it. And in this world, the few high-level existences most unwilling to see Amon obtain Sapphira Castle was Mr. Dor, followed by Palez, and then Zeradol. In other words, the two of them were short-term allies when it came to resisting Amon. Due to these factors, Klein believed that he could summon Zeradol in one go. And the facts proved that he was right. And it was precisely because of this that he wasn't worried at all that Amon would steal away his historical projection that he had summoned. He even hoped that the Angel of Time would do so. As for the reason why he first came up with the idea of committing suicide before summoning Zeratu, it was to let Amon steal his thoughts. And for Amon, he would be happy to try since he was a king of angels in search of excitement. With too many choices for him to choose from, it was unlikely he would repeat another thought usurpation. It might be the theft of a historical void projection. This was one of the few trump cards that Klein had. In the next second, Zeradol's gaze turned from a glazed one to a spirited and real one. Clearly, this attendant of mysteries, a senior scholar of yore, had entered the historical void and allowed his projection from the same era to receive his consciousness. And having his own consciousness meant that Zeradol's projection didn't hesitate at all to firmly cast his gaze at Amon. The eyes of Amon, the ones wearing and not wearing the monocle, narrowed at the same time. He saw the lightning around him increase in frequency as the vast wilderness with many ravines instantly turned empty and dark. They were speckled with twinkling stars. He had apparently been pulled beneath the cosmos by Zeradol. This was a miracle. As for the projection opposite of Amon, it had already transformed into a gigantic, mysterious whirlpool formed by squirming Mysterious. They extended out in all directions with transparent tentacles. Just looking at them would make humans lose their minds and turn crazy. At that moment, Klein abandoned the other thoughts in the queue. He took the opportunity to control a monster deep in the darkness and transform it into his marionette. Immediately following that, he switched places with his marionette. After coming to the depths of the darkness, Klein reached out his hand once again to grab at the air in front of him a few times in succession. His marionette did the same action as well. Finally, he dragged a new figure out of the void. It was a figure dressed in a simple linen robe, with a tree bark as a belt. Standing there, barefooted with long, black hair, Ariana's facial features were ordinary and her eyes dark and cold. The Evernight Cloister's matron, the ascetic leader, the servant of concealment, the grounded angel, Ariana. As soon as Ariana appeared, her dark eyes turned normal. She didn't look like a projection at all. Her true body seemed to have entered a concealed state, allowing the summoned historical void projection to also possess intelligence. This was also one of the reasons why Klein had chosen to summon her, and had given up on summoning Mr. Azek and Miss Messenger, who gave him a higher success rate. This way, even if an accident happened during his suicide, preventing his success, there was still a chance to fight Amon in the subsequent battle. After a historical void's projection possessed their own consciousness, it made it much easier for Klein to maintain them. This resulted in an extension in time for the maintenance of the projection. Following that, he used the connection between the Scholar of Yore and their summoned historical void projection, quickly communicating to Servant of Concealment, Ariana, his intent to kill him. Ariana suddenly bent her body, and her right hand reached behind her back. She pulled out a bone sword covered in strange patterns from the depths of the darkness. Then, she suddenly took a step forward and swung her sword forward. The entire darkness literally stirred as it wildly spread towards where the spot Klein was standing. An unlucky monster happened to be situated between the two of them as it melted away when drowned by the tide of darkness. This wasn't the authority of concealment. This was a combination of repose and horror. It symbolized danger in the darkness, a symbol of silent destruction and vanquishment. The Beyonders of the Sleepless Pathway had to reach Sequence 3 Horror Bishop to grasp such powers. Subconsciously, Klein's survival instinct made him attempt to escape. But at that moment, he felt that the surrounding darkness was an enemy. If he was infected by that force, he would become a part of the tide. There was no avoiding it. There's no need to use all your strength. You can easily kill me with just a portion of your strength. Klein restrained his primal instincts, and he stood on the spot, waiting for the destruction to sweep through him. At that moment, a distant, illusory bell sounded. It was as if it had traveled through a long stretch of history, causing everything around it to slow down, including the surging darkness. In midair, swaths of darkness were pierced, revealing a gigantic wall clock carved out of stone. It was ancient and mottled, and its surface was separated into 12 segments by grayish-white and bluish-black colors. Each segment had different symbols, and the needle had a total of 3 hands, short, medium, long. It seemed to be formed from the 12 rings of a worm of time. As the second hand ticked, the bell rang again. Gong! As the sound echoed, the surging darkness like a tide slowed down even more. Then, the ancient clock's projection dissipated, turning back into Amon with his pointed hat and monocle. Behind him, the projection of Zeradol was also in a sluggish state. Right on the heels of that, Amon levitated in midair, extending his right hand, and he pressed down at the darkness. The darkness quickly returned to normal, drowning Klein without causing him any damage. It was unknown if there was a bug or if a Beyonder effect had been stolen. At the same time, Amon's body instantly became abnormally huge. It was nearly 20 meters tall, but none of his clothes suffered any damage. He looked down at Klein and raised his hand to adjust his monocle. He ignored the attacks from the Zeradol projection behind him, as he curled his lips and said with deep interest, "Interesting." Chapter 1165. The Grand Lineup. As Amon spoke, the transparent tentacles covered with mysterious patterns extended out from the gigantic vortex behind his back, and they wrapped around his many different spirit body threads. In the blink of an eye, the illusory black threads were lifted up without any resistance. And with that, one strange monster after another was hoisted up in the air, like him waiting to be dry-aged. The spirit body threads beside Amon were all stolen by him at some point in time. While Zeradol launched his attack, his other slippery tentacle kept extending into the void, attempting to pull something back. In just a few seconds, a figure quickly appeared. He had long chestnut-colored curly hair, blue eyes, high nose bridge, thin lips, and a very beautifully manicured mustache. He wore a dark red coat with rusted golden threads. It was none other than the former emperor of Intis, Roselle Gustav. The moment this knowledge emperor stepped into the real world, he looked down at the gigantified Amon, and complicated and illusory symbols instantly formed in his eyes. He wasn't worried that Amon would steal his attack at all, because he had prepared an extremely large amount of useless miscellaneous knowledge. Be it the forceful injection or Amon's theft of it, he could achieve the goal of blowing up the other party's mind. Just as Emperor Rosel's projection was fully formed, another figure appeared from Zeradol's transparent tentacles. The figure had a young face, but his long hair was already half white, pulled back and flailing in the air. In the darkness, half of it was hidden, and the other was prominent. This was an angel that Klein didn't know. He looked like a man with eyes that were dark and filled with the vicissitudes of life. His facial features were considered pretty good, but there was a bunch of thick, short black hair on his cheeks. He emitted the feeling that he was both old and youthful, both rational and crazy. Read more at Ellis' novel. He immediately transformed into a cluster of squirming worms that extended out transparent, smooth tentacles akin to Zeradol's projection. Clearly, this was also an angel from the seer pathway. At that moment, Klein didn't even dare to look straight at the situation occurring in midair. However, when his spiritual perception triggered, he had already sensed something familiar. The second angel that was summoned by Zeradol was the son of an ancient god, the original ancestor of the Antigonus family. This was the historical projection, before he became the half-fool. Clearly, Zeradol had made sufficient preparations in this period of time. As Antigonus displayed his complete mythical creature form, the surrounding environment changed once again. The darkness became even darker, as though it had a life of its own as it surged towards the massive manifestation of the classic black-robed, pointy-hatted, and monocled Amon. In the area enveloped by darkness, all the monsters instantly turned into marionettes. Antigonus seemed to have moved a portion of the ancient divine kingdom from his memories into the real world, so as to separate Amon from Klein. This was also a miracle. When the miracle happened, Zeradol's transparent tentacles pulled out a third projection from the fog of history. This was a knight in full black armor. He was a demigod from the fourth epoch Solomon Empire, and had not left an illustrious name in history. However, he had another identity. He was a member of the Red of War army, and the leader of this army was King of Angels, Medici. In this division, every member could connect with Red Angel Medici's mind and become one. Read more at Ellis' novel. In other words, if Medici could converge their powers, then they too could also transmit their own powers to the collective pool. The powers of a scholar of your powers couldn't summon anything associated with the uniqueness. Even if they were to raise their sequence and receive a qualitative change, it remained the same. However, there was no doubt that seers would seek ways to push the envelope by attempting to bypass the restrictions and obtain help from the uniqueness to a certain extent. Klein had summoned the goddess's descent vessel to accomplish this point, while Zeradol summoned a powerhouse of the Red of War army. At this moment, that projection was equivalent to a portion of Medici. The knight in black armor stepped onto the battlefield. He scanned the battlefield in a sluggish manner before laughing out loud. "Yo, Lil Raven, have those feathers I burnt recovered?" Due to the fact that his historical projection had summoned another 3 angel-level historical projections, Klein suspected that he couldn't maintain it for 10 seconds. If it wasn't for this change, then he would most likely have felt that he had found a way to indefinitely increase his combat strength. That was to summon 2 angels and 1 projection of himself every time. Then, he could use his projection to summon 2 angels and himself again. If this continued, he would have an infinite number of projections available. At that moment, the ascetic leader of the Church of Evernight, Ariana's body faded and entered a concealed state. Following that, she suddenly appeared behind the gigantified Amon, slashing out with the bone sword that was covered in strange patterns. Taking advantage of the opportunity when Amon was being attacked by the 5 angel projections attack, Klein kept converting monsters into his marionettes, getting them to aim at him. He opened his mouth and let out a bang. Air cannons whistled towards him. At the same time, Klein stretched out his hand and easily took out a flaring sun charm that had already been activated and was just short of releasing its effects. He didn't believe that he would be able to survive such repeated attacks. Amidst the booms, Klein suddenly heard a tick-tock noise. The entire world seemed to stop for a moment before it returned to normal. Following that, he saw a huge hole in the dark sky. A ray of pure hot sunlight shone in and lit a golden charm. It was the flaring sun charm. It had turned into a huge ball of light that was engulfed by countless balls of flames. However, the target it attacked wasn't Klein. It had made an error and, instead, wrapped around the Red of War demigod. Meanwhile, the vast amount of knowledge that Roselle Gustave had injected, the miracle created by Antigonus, the destructive sword which Ariana had swung out, the transparent tentacles that Zeradal extended, they all pointed at the same target in an erroneous manner, Medici's black-armored subordinate. At some point, the projection that consisted of a part of Medici's will first suffered an explosion in his mind. Even his instinctive reaction seemed to have disappeared. Then, he was assaulted by the barrage of heavy attacks, and quickly dissipated in midair. Wearing a pointed hat and a classical mage robe, it was unknown when Amon had returned to the size of a human and landed at the bottom of the battlefield. He raised his right hand and adjusted the crystal monocle as a beam of light lit up. Behind his back, the ancient mottled clock phantom appeared once again. The longest second hand quickly spun half around at an extraordinary speed. It took less than a second, but everything on the desolate moors seemed to have lost 10 to 20 seconds. The projection of Antigonus's historical projection disappeared. Following that, Roselle's historical projection faded away. Finally, it was the historical projections of Zeradal and Ariana. The amount of time they could be maintained had been stolen. Klein, who was just about to commit suicide for the third time, couldn't believe his eyes. He had expected blasphemer Amon to resolve the 5 angel projections. After all, they were merely projections. A projection was much weaker than the actual body. However, Klein never expected the other party to be so casual about it that he didn't even have a chance to commit suicide. He had used his trump card in exchange for such an outcome. It was inevitable for him to feel disheartened and despair. Amon nudged his monocle and took a step forward to appear in front of him. He smiled. If they were all their true bodies, it would indeed be more troublesome. However, the historical void projection has a very huge flaw. And grasping the problem of something is what I'm best at. Looking at this angel of time whose smile remained the same while his expression was one of delight, as though he hadn't been in a difficult situation just now, Klein's heart slowly sank, as if he had fallen into an abyss. His spiritual perception was triggered as scenes quickly flashed through his mind. After entering the forsaken land of the gods, Amon changed his clothes, going from a dark-colored jacket, trousers, and black top hat that met the aesthetic standards of modern times to a classic mage's robe and a pointed hat. After that, he suggested a game of escaping and obstructing. He appeared extremely confident and wasn't worried about any mishaps. As his thoughts raced, Klein's throat turned dry, and he said in a low and hoarse voice, "You are the true body. After entering the forsaken land of the gods, your true body merged with your avatar." He seriously suspected that the person in front of him was Amon's true body, the true blasphemer, the whole king of angels. The corners of the monocled Amon's mouth curled up bit by bit. "This is very interesting, isn't it? The expression on your face after knowing the truth is what I wanted to see in this game." He had clearly admitted that he was the main body. He was born accommodating the uniqueness of the Marauder pathway. He was peerless amongst the ranks of those beneath that of deities. This meant that, unless a true deity descended, no matter how hard Klein struggled, he wouldn't be able to escape from Amon's hands. And this was the forsaken land of the gods. The only active deity was the true creator, and he wasn't too interested in Sapphira Castle. Although he had suspected that the Amon beside him had swapped with his actual body, Klein, who had experienced countless instances of hope, only to have them destroyed, experienced what was the ultimate sense of despair when he was truly certain of it. If it wasn't for the fact that the Tarot Club involved Miss Justice, Leonard, and company, as well as how he knew that Amon was best at deception, he would have admitted defeat and expressed his willingness to become his blessed. Isn't it normal to join the ranks of the opponents if you can't beat them? As he lampooned, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. He recalled the words that Amon had previously said. This. His eyes lit up, and he completely calmed down. Looking at Amon, he leisurely stretched his body and said with a smile, kill me. Chapter 116:6 Its name lightning once again lit up the desolate moors that were blanketed with grayish-yellow fog. It illuminated the spot where an angel-level battle had just happened, illuminating the calm smile on his face. Amon looked at him for a few seconds before nudging his monocle and smiling. "Can't you say something else? You seem to have found new hope." Klein's smile didn't change as he clenched his fist to his nose and stuck one hand into his pocket. "I just suddenly understood something. It turns out that it's not too demoralizing to play this game with your true body. On the contrary, this shows that you have no way of stealing my destiny." "Oh." Amon smiled as he spoke in a tone, as though he was looking forward to what Klein would say next. Klein laughed and said without any hesitation, "Otherwise, once I entered the forsaken land of the gods, you would have directly stolen my destiny and become the new owner of Sapphira Castle. Even if you want to play a game of escaping and obstructing, you could have waited until the main goal was achieved before doing so. That way, you wouldn't be taking any risks. And having lost my chance to resurrect and my original destiny, I'll put in an even greater effort into escaping due to my instinct to survive. Indeed, the god of mischief might do something that disregards danger, doing so in pursuit of excitement, but you're still the god of deceit." Having said that, Klein looked at the unperturbed expression on Amon's face and paused. "I know that you really have the ability to steal the destinies of others, but being capable of doing something doesn't mean that you'll do it. This requires a risk assessment, as well as weighing and analyzing the pros and cons. I believe that you don't wish to steal my destiny directly. That will make you bear the burden of everything brought about by Sapphira Castle. You have to resist the trauma of the resurrection of its original owner. Even for a king of angels like you, this is also very dangerous. If you aren't careful, you can perish. Therefore, you want to find a loophole. You want to get Sapphira Castle without suffering the negative effects. And this requires my permission." When he said that, Klein thought of the experience of getting hit by computer viruses in his previous life. Those viruses would always pretend to be normal and cheat him into giving him permission. This was somewhat similar to the current situation. After hearing Klein's words, Amon looked at him without a word. Instead, he calmly adjusted the crystal monocle. Klein smiled and continued, "From the moment you parasitized me, you've been setting up a huge scam. On the one hand, you've given me the option of becoming your blessed, telling me that your true body can withstand my destiny, causing me to bear a heavy psychological burden. In the subsequent journey, you constantly made me see hope before destroying it. From time to time, you'll give me a time limit, making me unknowingly seize an opportunity and catch my breath. Then, you suddenly shortened the trip, disrupting my plans. Finally, you reveal the card that you're the true body, sending me into the abyss of despair, so as to destroy my will and dismantle my mental defenses. I would completely break down and choose to become your blessed, and agree to that hidden transaction." After hearing everything in silence, Amon suddenly laughed and raised his hands to gently clap. "Perfect deduction. However, you seem to have missed a problem. What I said was to see my real body at a sufficiently safe place. Then, your destiny will be taken away. Now that we haven't reached our final destination, I naturally won't take the risk." Klein's expression sank slightly before he relaxed again. "I'm looking forward to how different the developments will be there," he responded to Amon in his style. The genuine king of angels adjusted his monocle and pointed to the side with a smile. "Soon. We'll arrive in less than half a day." "How long is that exactly?" Klein instinctively lacked trust in Amon's vague descriptions. Amon scratched his chin and chuckled. "Half an hour." Klein turned his head to look in the direction where Amon had pointed. He only saw deep darkness, nothing else. A bolt of lightning streaked across the desolate moors, but even farther away was a thick grayish-yellow fog. Backlund, Empress Borough, in the Hall family's luxurious villa. After 2 days of chaos, Audrey's life finally regained some peace. This made her even more curious about the truth behind the king's assassination. Considering how Mr. Fool had seemingly hinted that the tarot gathering would be cancelled today, Audrey decided to pray to this existence in advance and establish a connection with the world Gehrman Sparrow to figure out the corresponding situation. The moment she glanced at Susie, the golden retriever immediately walked out of the room, closed the door with her leg in passing, and sat outside. Audrey sat down, took on a prayer pose, and recited in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Backlund East Borough, inside a 2-bedroom rental apartment. Do you think there will be a gathering today? There's no formal notice. Furs took out her pocket watch for women and opened it. Zio shook her head. I don't know. Furs couldn't sit still any longer. She left her seat and paced back and forth anxiously as she muttered to herself. Mr. World didn't respond, neither did Mr. Fool respond. As she spoke, Furs suddenly looked at her friend who was eating some ham. She hurriedly said, Zio, why don't you try praying to Mr. Fool and ask if the gathering will be held as scheduled today? Zio frowned slightly as she put down her fork and nodded. Okay. She also found the situation a little strange. She clasped her hands and held them under her chin. Zio took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Backlund, Northborough, underground of St. Samuel Cathedral, in a room behind Cheney's Gate. Emlyn White woke up, feeling puzzled over the dream he had. He had apparently dreamed of the sanguine ancestor, Lilith. In his dream, he was trapped in a castle covered in red grapevines, one he couldn't escape from no matter how hard he tried. Later, through a narrow window from high above, he saw the crimson moon outside and a pair of bat wings that covered half the crimson moon. In the legends of the sanguine, this was one of the symbols of the ancient goddess, Lilith. Right on the heels of that, Emlyn flew up high in excitement, attempting to open the narrow window. At the bottom of the glass, he found a tarot card. On the surface of the tarot card was a lad dressed in gorgeous clothes. He was wearing splendid headgear with a stick over his shoulder. There was a bindle hanging on the end of the stick, and a puppy was following behind him. The Fool card. At this point in his dream, Emlyn naturally woke up. As a sanguine viscount, he had the ability to perform a basic analysis of dreams. It must be because of my current situation that this dream appeared. That star actually didn't deliver any human blood to me. I am indeed the target of the ancestors' benediction. She is hinting to me that if I wish to escape from my predicament, I have to obtain help from Mr. Fool. What day is it today? Forget it, I'll just pray. That way, I can leave as soon as possible. Emlyn sat up with hope as he piously chanted, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Above the gray fog, the 3 crimson stars that corresponded to justice, judgment, and the moon began to expand and shrink, emitting light to create ripples. They merged into the dark red tide that originally existed, causing the shock waves in the mysterious space to instantly intensify. Amidst the quake, the tide flooded the ancient and majestic palace, lighting up one mysterious symbol after another behind the 8 seats on the long bronze table. This brought a new halo and resonance, accompanied by a buzzing sound. At the end of the long, mottled table, the back of the fool's seat lit up as well. The complicated symbol formed by the contorted lines and pupilless eye kept extending outwards, becoming layered and extremely three-dimensional. The dark red tide was attracted over and formed a figure on the high back chair belonging to the fool. This figure wasn't stable enough. It distorted and scattered from time to time, hardly capable of maintaining its form. On a desolate moor covered with grayish-yellow fog, Klein paused for a moment and looked up at the lightning that streaked across the sky. He then retracted his gaze. Holding the lantern in his hand, he followed beside Amon, deep into the endless moors. The more the man and the king of angels proceeded, the more ravines the ground had. Similarly, their depths became more and more exaggerated. About 10 minutes later, another bolt of lightning streaked across the sky. Not far away, Klein saw a single-eyed giant with a bluish-black pupil, pacing back and forth. It towered tens of meters. His body was covered in traces of rotting pus. His eye was sunken and lifeless. It was obvious that he was dead. However, he continued wandering around. Grayish-yellow gas emanated from his body, interweaving in midair to create the fog over the moor. The grayish-yellow fog that enveloped the vast moor was actually generated by this bluish-black giant. The youngest son of the giant King Ormer, the god of glory, Blattle. He publicly cursed my father and was punished to forever roam this area. Of course, he has long died in the cataclysm, but he still wasn't able to free himself. Amon looked at the giant and smiled. If I hadn't stolen the corresponding damage dealt to you, you would have been contaminated by the fog created after Blattle's death. You would become a cursed entity that roams this area. Do I have to thank you? Suddenly, Klein felt like he had entered a myth. With him in tow, Amon continued forward. Soon, they approached the bluish-black, single-eyed giant. There was an extremely deep ravine on the spot where the giant was loitering about. As the lightning flashed, a thick and vast grayish-white building appeared at the bottom. With just a glance, Klein's eyelids twitched slightly as he recalled the scene he saw when he was divining the unshadowed crucifix. If he remembered correctly, this should be where the ancient sun god, the City of Silver's creator, Amon and Adam's father walked out from. Is this the safe place that Amon mentioned? Klein's heart sank. At this moment, the pointy-hatted, monocled Amon walked to the edge of the ravine. With his back facing the grayish-white building, he spread his arms slightly and said with a smile, "This is the Holy Land where my father was awoken. Buried in it is the history I wish to seek. My father told me that this place has an ancient name, called," as a streak of silver lightning tore through the sky, the black-robed Amon paused as he widened his arms, saying with a solemn tone, "Chernobyl." Chapter 1167 When the Stars Are Rye, Chernobyl. Upon hearing Amon's words, Klein's first reaction was one of shock. Back when they were approaching the bluish-black, single-eyed giant, he had come up with many possibilities, but he never expected to hear such a name. This was akin to seeing a machine gun appear in an ancient oil painting, or a novel's plot appearing in a scientific paper. It was filled with unbelievable contradictions. In the next second, he thought of the funny matter about how the ancient sun god had used his rib to create dark angel Sasra, but had named his eldest son Adam. He instinctively believed that the current situation was similar, and he couldn't help but laugh. To have Amon, who was so powerful that he was almost a bug in the real world, a king of angels who always wore a sinister smile on his face, speak the name with such seriousness and solemnity, it made Klein unable to hold back his laughter. Besides, he had no intention of controlling himself. It's best if he gets angry from the embarrassment and kills me. The reason Amon is this way today has largely to do with the ancient sun god's method of upbringing. The corners of Klein's mouth curved into a smile, prepared to ruthlessly vent his inner laughter. At this moment, another bolt of silvery white lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the deep ravine. It made Klein once again see the grayish-white building at the bottom. This was a building that was completely different from the current style of the fourth, third, and even the second epoch. Thump. Klein's heart rapidly contracted before it expanded again. The smile he just made froze on his face. Thump. Thump. When he heard his own heartbeat, he suddenly had the common sense he had regarding the present world appear in his mind. 12 months a year, 365 days a year, has leap years. 24 hours a day, 60 minutes a day, 60 seconds a minute. It's confirmed to be a planet. There's a sun and a moon in the sky. Ba-dump. 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 Klein's instinct prevented him from thinking any further, but deep in his heart, there was still a voice. Could it be that I've never actually transmigrated? I've always been on Earth the entire time, but I've been hanging from the door of light above the gray fog for too long, making me truly not belong to this era. As this thought formed, many details that didn't catch his attention spewed out like a volcano in his mind. To the easternmost front of the Sonia Sea, before entering the ruins of the battlefield of the gods, there are rotting and crumbling steel buildings around the ancient well. They appeared to be left behind by humans. The northern and southern continent are overall very similar in shape to that of North and South America. However, a large part of the isthmus that connects the two landmasses has been wiped away by some kind of power, forming the Berserk Sea with its complicated and winding sea routes. Also, Sonia Island is like the gigantic landmass in the north that drifted south. Mid-Seashore is like the expanded and connected version of the Great Lakes of North America. It's as though it suffered a strike from a massive meteor. The mountains and rivers on the northern continent have changed a lot, but the overall shape is barely recognizable. In that case, the western continent where the elves come from, and the forsaken land of the gods in the eastern continent, will correspond to Chernobyl. In the legends of treasure out at sea, there's a lost civilization called the Nuans. It sank somewhere in the fog sea. The giant king's parents are humans. The sanguine elves also seem to originate from humans. I previously had two questions. Why would Sapphira Castle grab transmigrators from Earth? Why would all of them be people from my era? This can also be explained. In the short span of 2 to 3 seconds, it was as if lightning was constantly exploding in his mind. This caused his lips to tremble slightly, as though he was trying his best to contain the backlash of his revelation. But the moon in this world is crimson. The constellations are somewhat different from those of Earth. I'm not an astronomy aficionado, so I can't remember clearly. However, the Emperor consumed the potions from the savant pathway. If the cosmos was completely identical, he would have discovered it a long time ago. The opposing opinion appeared in Klein's mind. They were like a strong anchor, preventing his ship from being blown away from the port in the midst of the storm. But 1 second later, he remembered 2 lines. One sentence was a terrifying prophecy that he had read online in his previous life. When the stars are right, chaos will rise from underground, and the great oldest one will awaken. The other was, be careful of the moon. That prophecy wasn't randomly made up. When the stars are right. So, this resulted in the previous discrepancies? Klein almost ignored Amon in front of him. Even his body began to tremble. He used a great deal of strength before he sighed inwardly. Perhaps, I've never left my hometown, but I will never be able to return home. Just as he came to this understanding and realization, the grayish-white fog silently appeared in front of him. This time, he directly stood in front of the waning forest, which corresponded to the end of the first epoch and the early stages of the second epoch. Unlike the past, the boundless gray fog in front of him was no longer empty. Deep in the fog, in a very far distance, points of shattered light were lit up. They were like lighthouses, illuminating the path of history. They led Klein forward as they traced back thousands of years, or even further. Then, he saw the resplendent bluish-black door of light. He saw transparent cocoons hanging above it, and himself in a t-shirt and loose pants. An invisible wind blew past as the grayish-white fog beneath the door opened, layer by layer, revealing cities. There were tall skyscrapers with all kinds of cars parked, frozen with pedestrians that walked past. One by one, these cities were covered in grayish-white dust. Many buildings had collapsed, broken steel bars tearing out of their frames. Some of the cars had caved in, others had broken down. There were even some that had been squashed into metallic pancakes. The passers-by looked lifeless, like wax figures. Upon seeing this scene, Klein stopped and stared intently. He knew very well that this world was Earth. At that moment, he completely digested the scholar of your potion. Suddenly, Klein's consciousness returned to the real world. He realized that his connection with Sapphira Castle had strengthened. Amidst the buzzing sounds, the resonance generated by the prayers of the Tarot Club members grew in intensity. Previously, he could use them to vaguely sense Sapphira Castle above the gray fog and see that the Klein at the Fool's Seat was trying to establish some sort of connection with the dark red, warping figure that was about to take form. In an instant, he came to a realization. There was no longer a need for him to chant the incantation or take 4 steps counterclockwise. With a mere thought, his spirit body could enter Sapphira Castle, becoming one with that figure. This was undoubtedly the best opportunity for him to escape. he couldn't be bothered to marvel at the fact that this world was Earth. Believing that Amon definitely didn't know of such a development, Klein immediately thought of jumping straight towards Sapphira Castle. At this moment, the corner of his eye reflected the pointy-hatted, monocled, classic mage-robed Amon curled his lips into a smile, one that spoke of endless joy. Klein's mind suddenly exploded as all his thoughts were occupied by the crazy raving from Amon. "You're right. I didn't want to steal your destiny, bearing the burden while becoming the new owner of Sapphira Castle. You're right. This was a scam that has been going on since the beginning. However, the core of this scam was to make you think that me giving you hope and destroying it was to break your will and make you agree to become my blessed. If I hadn't specially changed my clothes when I entered the forsaken land of the gods, as well as my accidental use of error powers, would you have been so sure that my true body was already here? Could it be possible that the god of deceit doesn't understand that changing one's image would expose many problems? Did you think that I wouldn't understand what the name Chernobyl means? I've been in the forsaken land of the gods for more than 1,000 years. I've been searching for the oldest traces of history, the ones that go far beyond the first epoch. The true goal of this journey was to give you some time and give you some historical knowledge to aid you in digesting the scholar of your potion, so that you can relax your vigilance in this area. Then, when your connection with Sapphira Castle deepens and you attempt to trigger it, I'll seize this opportunity and use a loophole to steal Sapphira Castle. The destiny shall be yours, and Sapphira Castle shall be mine." Not only did the terrifying ravings from the King of Angels contain the sounds of Amon's chuckle, but they also wreaked havoc on Klein's mental state. They were no weaker than Mr. Door's roar. The surface of Klein's skin began to show signs of protruding worms of spirit as he was brought to the brink of losing control. In his body, a 12-segmented worm of time burrowed out, transforming into an Amon phantom wearing a black mage robe and a matching pointy hat and crystal monocle. He had parasitized Klein at a superficial level, not to monitor his thoughts, but rather to take control of the situation at the critical moment through parasitizing him at a deeper level. He wanted to seize this opportunity. In the beginning, Amon had used a deeper level of parasitizing with one main goal, to parasitize a worm of time at a superficial level, without the saint being able to detect it. The Amon projection turned back and gave Klein, who was unable to straighten his thoughts after being disrupted by the ravings, a look. It revealed a smile that was identical to its true body. The corners of his lips curled up slightly, carrying a look of endless joy. He turned around and used the invisible connection to leap towards Sapphira Castle above the grey fog. This was similar to the situation of him parasitizing Derek Berg in trying to use the crimson star that corresponded to the sun to infiltrate the world above the grey fog. But this time, no one was inside Sapphira Castle to purify him, to close the door, to stop Amon. This was a spectacular act. This was the god of deceit. Chapter 1168. My anchors in the blink of an eye, Amon saw the grayish-white fog and the ancient and majestic palace above. He just needed to reach out his hand and pass through the final obstacle to truly touch Sapphira Castle and directly occupy the place and, in essence, take it away. But at that moment, a gigantic bluish-black palm suddenly appeared above the Amon phantom, blocking him from entering Sapphira Castle. Amon's projection subconsciously turned its head and looked in the direction of the palm. It saw the pus-covered, one-eyed giant who had long since died. Bladel, who was known as the god of glory, still didn't show any signs of life in his exaggerated vertical eye. The curse of the grayish-yellow fog kept emanating from his body. However, it was different from before. There were seemingly illusory black tubes behind his back. They extended all the way into the infinite distance, a mystery as to what they were connected to. Boom! Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. The towering bluish-black giant instantly condensed a broadsword formed from the orange-red light of dusk. Holding it in one hand, he cleaved down at the side of the deep ravine where Amon's body was. This youngest son of the giant king, the one who had died due to the curse, suddenly unleashed an unimaginable power after roaming aimlessly for thousands of years. The twilight sword tore through the void and jumped out from the spot where the Angel of Time, Amon, was standing. It ripped through everything around it, turning into a storm that could destroy this desolate moor. Amon didn't move and remained standing there. No matter how the orange-red sword storm raged, it didn't harm him at all. He seemed to have used some sort of error in this world again. However, in this state, Amon was no longer able to transmit his ravings into Klein's mind, allowing him to finally gain a sliver of peace. Ignoring how he was about to lose control, he regained his clarity of mind using the clear and real surroundings and the layers of prayer. Then, he immediately resonated with the dark red figure sitting at the fool's seat above the gray fog, and he established a new connection. He didn't hesitate to return to Sapphira Castle. And at this moment, Amon's phantom, which was attempting to infiltrate above the gray fog, was obstructed by the bluish-black palm of the god of glory, Blattle. He wasn't able to instantly break through the titanic obstruction. The monocled king of angels, be it his avatar or true body, opened his mouth and said a name, Evernight. Yes, this was help coming from the Evernight goddess, but it wasn't without reason. Although Klein lacked confidence in this matter, he had always kept it as one of his trump cards. He only believed that it might not be effective and had a very low chance of success. It could only be used as a glimmer of hope at his most desperate hour. After entering the forsaken land of the gods and obtaining some space to think on his own, he worked hard to find resources available to him that could be used. Then, he recalled something, the matter of the former chief of the City of Silver. This demon hunter had attempted to switch to sequence 3 ferrymen of the death pathway, but he ended up turning into a monster inside the mausoleum he built. This anomaly was related to illusory black tubes, and such a phenomenon had been seen from the numinous sect's artificial death. In other words, the mutation of the former chief of the City of Silver was very likely related to artificial death. This indirectly explains something, that for some unknown reason, those that could influence the forsaken land of the gods, other than the true creator, included artificial death who had come to life to a certain level. And now, artificial death could be considered the Evernight goddess in some ways. Based on this reasoning, Klein suspected that the goddess could use the uniqueness of the death pathway to exert a low level of influence to some degree on certain things in the forsaken land of the gods. In addition, there were only 3 people involved in the matter regarding the former chief of the City of Silver. One of them was the current chief, Colin Iliad, the demigod elder, Waite Chermont, and shepherd elder, Lovia. They were either sequence 4 saints or an important believer of the true creator. It was impossible for them to be completely unaware that they had been parasitized by Amon. As for the only person who received feedback from the escapade, it was Derek Berg, who was under the fool's watch. He wasn't one of Amon's parasites either. In other words, Amon wasn't aware of the former City of Silver chief's abnormality involving the black illusory tubes. That was key. Therefore, even if he was able to guess that the Evernight goddess had obtained the uniqueness of the death pathway, causing the god of combat to have an intense reaction, there was no way for him to know that this would bring about unforeseen developments to the forsaken land of the gods. With this knowledge in mind, Klein consciously performed certain tasks, despite not having much confidence. In the city that believed in the Phoenix, he didn't take away the remaining death pathway's beyond her characteristics, hoping to leave a trail. After summoning Zeradol's historical projection, he didn't seize the opportunity to commit suicide immediately. On the one hand, he was afraid that Amon would still have the ability to stop him and affect his other arrangements, while on the other hand, he tried to use the summoning of the Servant of Concealment Ariana's projection to inform the Evernight goddess about the exact situation. After completing these 2 matters, Klein had no idea what the final outcome would be. He had mostly focused his attention on the fact that Amon's avatar had been replaced by his true body. When he arrived at his final destination and saw the roaming angel's corpse, he had just thought of something when he was distracted by Amon's introduction. It took him only until now to realize that the goddess had long gained some rudimentary control of this giant king's youngest son through the death pathway's uniqueness. She had been patiently waiting for an opportunity to use this cursed angel. And the concealment forces that filled the forsaken land of the gods helped her conceal the illusory black tubes very well. Suddenly, in the ancient palace above the gray fog, at the fool's seat situated at the end of the long, model table, the dark red figure that kept warping and scattering took the form of the scholarly Klein with his black hair and brown eyes. With just a thought, Klein's consciousness and spirit body had returned to Sapphira Castle. Following that, he used the close connection between his body and Sapphira Castle, together with the prayers of the Tarot Club members, to amplify the resonance effect. He then saw himself, glazed eyes, on the brink of losing control. He saw Amon's projection which had circled around the bluish-black palm using an error. The monocled Amon raised his head, making eye contact with Klein, who was seated at the fool's seat. Klein beckoned for the sea god's scepter and raised it. The entire gray fog boiled as the entirety of Sapphira Castle quaked. A vast amount of terrifying power gathered over, transforming into a torrent of lightning. The blue gems that lit up at the same time sent an illuminating light that surged down like a torrent, drowning Amon's avatars and his own body. A deep rumble of thunder echoed as the terrifying silver lightning tore everything it enveloped apart. Amon's projection disintegrated, and Klein's body was destroyed. He had finally succeeded in committing suicide. After completing this attack, Klein, who was high above the gray fog, immediately cut off the connection between Sapphira Castle and the real world, so as to prevent Amon's true body from creating any new accidents. Right on the heels of that, he began to wait for the miracle and waited for his resurrection. Beside the deep ravine which had grayish-white buildings at the bottom, Amon's true body adjusted the crystal monocle, stealing the curse that kept Blattle existing. The bluish-black giant immediately began to rot, quickly being reduced to bones. The illusory black tubes didn't persist, and they instead shrank back into the depths of the darkness. Dressed in a pointed hat and a classic black robe, Amon stood there. He raised his head and looked into the sky silently for a few seconds, as though he was looking at Sapphira Castle through the fog of history. Finally, he pinched the crystal monocle and muttered to himself as the corners of his mouth curled up. Interesting. In the ancient palace, at the end of the long, model table, Klein sat at the seat belonging to the fool. He carefully looked down at the grayish-white fog. He discovered that the beyonder characteristics that had been destroyed with his body had unknowingly entered the historical void. It fused with the worms of spirit from the past, turning them corporeal. As long as Klein willed it from Sapphira Castle, these worms of spirit would immediately be able to escape the fog of history and reform his body in the real world. The miracle of resurrection was essentially a deeper use of one's strength from the past. Miracles happen using the past and future? Klein frowned slightly as he attempted to analyze how the miracle in Miracle Invoker came about. After thinking for a few seconds, he quickly pulled his attention back and attempted to revive himself in Sapphira Castle. Then, he discovered a problem: his body could only be revived in the real world. Furthermore, it had to be within a certain range of his remains. As for his spirit body, it could be reborn above the gray fog, but Klein's spirit body hadn't been destroyed, it was sitting on the high-back chair of the fool. Obtaining help from the past works. The number of resurrections I'm using now is depleting the number I'll have after I become a miracle invoker. From the looks of it, there's only one chance now. TSK. Amon should be guarding my corpse now. I have to think of a way to get out of this predicament. His sense of time is different from a human's. He's a very patient god of mischief. Yes, my current state can only be maintained for 3 days. After that period of time, I won't be able to borrow powers from the past to resurrect. If it really doesn't work, I'll just abandon my body and become an undead. Klein's mind raced. Although he was somewhat vexed, he was in his most relaxed state over the past few days. He finally got out of that nearly hopeless situation. He looked at the high-back chairs that had symbols light up on their backs, as well as the burgeoning and contracting dark red stars. Klein exhaled and relaxed as he leaned back into his chair. He couldn't help but reveal a smile. These are my anchors. Author's note: this arc has finally come to an end. The whole story's origins was when I was reading the Cthulhu myth. When I saw the line about the stars being right, I suddenly thought of this. We often say that Cthulhu will awaken soon, but what happens if Cthulhu has already awakened? For those who don't know much about Cthulhu, it doesn't matter. Just treat this name as an evil god. After all, the corresponding deities were completely reconstructed by me. Chapter 1169. Klein's plan. The flashing dark red glow slightly warmed Klein's heart. He felt that he wasn't that lonely, and that someone still remembered him. As the illusory, overlapping sounds of prayers became clearer and clearer, turning increasingly real, noisy, and chaotic, he realized that Sapphira Castle was summoning him, and the resonance between the two was growing stronger. After all the members of the Tarot Club had completed their prayers, Klein had a vague feeling that he could enter Sapphira Castle at any time, allowing his consciousness to manifest there instantly. However, he was still obstructed by that one last obstacle. This problem was finally resolved after he completely digested the Scholar of Your potion. It was also because of this that he had the opportunity to return to Sapphira Castle before Amon broke past the obstruction from the God of Glory, Blattle. In just 2 short days, all the members of the Tarot Club have prayed. Generally speaking, there shouldn't be a coincidence like this. Some aren't problematic, but there are some that seem to have been affected by the goddess and will. I was lucky enough, so I naturally had a good development. After careful thought, he realized how unreasonable certain parts were, but this was something that could be explained, and there was no need to pay too much attention to it. After changing his seating posture slightly, Klein's gaze gradually darkened. Although he felt that he might not be able to return home the moment he saw the door of light and cocoons, he still felt that his hopes were completely destroyed upon confirming that this world was his former hometown. The light of dawn was swallowed by the darkness. Back then, using "the fool that doesn't belong to this era" as an honorific name might be a revelation given to me by my spiritual intuition. In the deepest part of my heart, I might have sensed something. Yes, I remember that I transmigrated while I was sleeping. But why was I wearing a t-shirt and loose pants while hanging in the cocoon? Klein frowned slightly as he cast his gaze at the grayish-white fog under Sapphira Castle. As he searched for the reason for the fragments of light in the fog of history, he tried hard to recall every detail of that fateful night. Finally, he found the corresponding historical segment. Zhou Mingrue, who was wearing a t-shirt and loose pants, set up the luck enhancement ritual before dinner. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and recited incantations like, "The immortal Lord of heaven and earth for blessings." In his memories, nothing had happened back then, but the scene in history wasn't like this. After Zhou Mingrue finished his 4 steps and completed the ritual, his face turned pale and his eyes glazed over. Following that, he ate his meal in a daze. He read books, watched dramas, and fiddled with his phone as if he was completing a predetermined program. Finally, Zhou Mingrue came to the sink and looked at his lifeless eyes in the mirror. He brushed his teeth, washed his face, and went to bed. During this process, he didn't change out of his t-shirt and loose pants. He covered himself with the blanket and closed his eyes. Before long, an intense light and violent shaking ended the corresponding historical scene. Klein couldn't help but raise his hand and rub his temples. He gave a self-deprecating laugh. So the idea of there not being any changes and everything being normal after the luck enhancement ceremony was simply what I concluded. In actual fact, my body had already experienced certain anomalies. If it were in the past, he would definitely feel horrified and scared about the truth of the matter. However, after suffering from shock so many times, with his worldview nearly collapsing just moments ago, such a trivial matter was unable to generate any intense ripples in him. However, after discovering this, combined with the Emperor's transmigration, a result of buying a mysterious silver plate, as well as one of the hanging spirit bodies in the transparent cocoons actually having a cell phone on them, Klein quickly had some guesses about what had happened back then. It should be the owner of Sapphira Castle affecting reality, disseminating the luck enhancement ritual, mysterious silver plate, mutated cell phones, and other things. Anyone that obtains them and performs some required procedure would end up being pulled above the gray fog at some point, hanging by the door of light. This was a random selection. It didn't point to a specific target. I don't know if I'm lucky or unlucky. However, Why was it named Quintessential Divination and Arcane Arts of the Qin and Han Dynasty? Was it randomly made up by the influenced humans, or was it really passed down from the Qin and Han Dynasty era? It's not that it's impossible. If the "when the stars are right" prophecy is true, and if it corresponds to the Creator, the oldest one, then he has always been in a deep slumber underground. He was like that in ancient times, a time that was far more ancient than ancient times. As for Sapphira Castle, it said that it was a manifestation of parts of his body. This isn't a sanctuary or escape pod. In the beginning, the oldest one was, on the one hand, waiting to awaken and destroy the world. On the other hand, he was trying to influence reality with a tiny amount of constant fluctuations. By disseminating the ritual and making other arrangements, wouldn't that be somewhat contradictory? That prophecy must have been made by the humans that were influenced by him. Klein stretched out his right hand and lightly knocked on the edge of the long model table, stuck in a conundrum that was temporarily impossible to answer. Soon, he remembered a sentence and some things. That statement was, "Whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate." Those things were, the ancient sun god, Amon, and Adam's father deliberately separated his negative personality. Beyonders who were close to the ground or encountered some corruption would gradually form a brand new self. After reaching the moon, Emperor Rosel's personality had changed a little without him realizing it. Many of the 22 Beyonder pathways were conflicting, just like Demonis and Hunter. Perhaps the Creator, the oldest one, was an amalgamation of contradictions, and he could only relieve this problem by sleeping. Klein had a certain guess, but he was unable to verify it. He wasn't even sure if the oldest one, who would awaken when the stars were right, as spoken of in mythical legend in his previous life, was the creator of all things who splintered into everything in present-day myths. This required more clues and more evidence to confirm. He couldn't just rely on his own guesses and imagination. "It's not like I'm a visionary," Klein thought in a self-deprecating manner. He then cast his gaze upwards. It was almost comprised solely of gray nothingness there, with some grayish-white clouds floating there. There are still many things I need to confirm. For example, is that so-called Chernobyl a sanctuary created by humans after the awakening of the oldest one? Or did the Beyonder characteristics of the 22 Beyonder pathways really originate from the oldest one? Another would be the positions of the constellations. Is it actually normal, or is it abnormal now? Does the 1368 apocalypse correspond to the moment when the stars are right? And finally, the origins of the first blasphemy slate and what exactly is on the moon. Thinking of this, Klein suddenly stopped tapping his fingers and softly said, "For example, the hometown of the elves, the legendary western continent, whether it exists or not, and why can't anyone go there?" The answer to his question was a long period of silence. He slowly leaned back and rested his arms on the armrest. After a few minutes, Klein closed his eyes and had an idea. Or rather, he decided. After he successfully revived, he planned on staying in the forsaken land of the gods for some time to seek out some questions. Just as Emperor Rosel had said, many of the answers were in the forsaken land of the gods. Blasphemer Amon had wandered here for more than 1,000 years to explore the history that surpassed the first epoch. Furthermore, if he kept heading east in the forsaken land of the gods, he might reach the legendary western continent. Klein cast his gaze outside the ancient palace as he looked into the distance. To him, staying in the forsaken land of the gods for some time was also a type of strategy. At the very least, this would attract the attention of Amon, making him not need to mobilize his avatars in the outside world to search for Gehrman Sparrow in Lone or Backlund. That would bring great danger to the people that he knew. Thankfully, the avatars of Amon who knew that I'm soft-hearted had been wiped out. The corresponding information was also not propagated because of the existence of concealment. If not for that, Amon might end up directly using the lives of Benson, Melissa, Leonard, and Miss Justice to threaten me. I don't even dare to think of the outcome. Heh heh, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck has finally shown its powers. Phew, even if I want to leave the forsaken land of the gods, I don't have a solution now. I have to barge into the place where the dark angel is sleeping. Klein shook his head and felt that even if he could resurrect, he would be facing all kinds of dangers. No matter how he thought about it, a scholar of yore wouldn't last long if he were tracked by a king of angels. The key to the matter was that the Evernight goddess was still digesting the uniqueness of the death pathway. She could only spare a limited amount of power for infiltrating the forsaken land of the gods. Once the Angel of Time, who wielded the authority of error, was prepared, it was nearly impossible to accomplish what had happened today. On the one hand, I have to seek help from other possible existences. When I successfully revive, I will attempt to use my marionette to recite the honorific name of the Lord of Storms, Eternal Blazing Sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Let's see if they have any means to descend into the forsaken land of the gods. They had fed on the ancient sun god back then, so they definitely do not wish for Amon to obtain Sapphira Castle. On the other hand, since the scholar of yours potion has been completely digested, I'll have to consider becoming a miracle invoker. As long as I have an angel's status and become a complete mythical creature, my situation will be much better. At the very least, I'll be able to withstand a wave of Amon's ravings when facing his true body. Klein decided to use the medium to spy on the terrifying maggot cluster on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range once his spirit body recovered. From there, he could obtain the knowledge corresponding to a miracle invoker. It was highly likely that it was the half-fool of the Antigonus family. After considering his future plans, he looked around and answered the crimson stars one at a time. The tarot gathering will proceed as usual today. He wanted to see if Ma'am Hermit, Mr. Hanged Man, and the others could provide him with inspiration and allow him to be revived far away from Amon. Of course, it was necessary to use an ingenious excuse. After responding, the world above the gray fog became extremely quiet again. Klein sat at the seat of the fool, temporarily with nowhere to go. After a moment of silence, he leaned forward slightly and used his right hand to support his head, looking straight ahead. On the long, mottled table, a variety of delicacies and exquisite candles appeared. As for the high-backed chairs around it, they became even closer in style to the current times. One figure after another appeared. One of them was an elderly man with a loud voice and silver strands in his black hair. Another was a woman who was nearly 50 years old. She had an Asian face with short hair that only reached her ears. Some of them were young men who were playing with their phones and enjoying the sumptuous food, while others were young ladies who were laughing and joking. Behind them, new figures appeared one after another. It was the gray-eyed Dun with a receding hairline, and Daly with her blue eyeshadow and blush. With a smile on their faces, they surrounded the long, warm table surrounded by candlelight above the grayish-white fog. They chatted happily and commented on the delicacies from time to time. Klein maintained his expression and posture as he propped his hand on the side of his face and silently watched this scene in stillness for an extended period of time. Chapter 1170 Ritual Backlund, Northborough. Leonard, who had just arranged a mission for his team, saw the boundless gray fog and heard Mr. Fool's response. He let out a long sigh of relief and said in a low voice, "Seems like there are no more problems." Since Mr. Fool was able to provide feedback, as per normal, and convene the tarot gathering, it meant that he had already won the battle against Amon. This way, Klein was likely able to escape from his predicament. In Leonard's mind, Palaz Zorost's slightly aged voice scoffed, "Don't count your chickens until they've hatched. After you enter Sapphira Castle, observe if the fool is wearing a monocle on his right eye." Are you saying that the present fool might be Amon in disguise? Leonard's eyelids twitched as he hurriedly asked. Palaz sighed and said, "You can't eliminate this possibility. Amon can really do such a thing. I will take note." Leonard's relaxed state of mind instantly tensed up again. On the future, in the Sonia Sea. Mr. Fool actually responded after so much time. Does this mean that the World Gehrman Sparrow's disappearance had something to do with his plan? I can't be sure. Perhaps Mr. Fool's lack of response during this period of time was to save Gehrman Sparrow. And now, he has succeeded. He didn't directly mention this matter. He is planning to let the world tell the story at the tarot gathering? After hearing Mr. Fool's voice, many thoughts instantly flashed across Catlia's mind. From Queen Mystic's letter, she suspected that George III's death was due to Mr. Fool's interference. The disappearance of the world Gehrman Sparrow was also an extension of this matter. Catlia's first reaction was to write to Queen Mystic Bernadette and tell her that Gehrman Sparrow has been found. However, after some thought, she suppressed her urge, and she prepared to participate in the afternoon's gathering. She wanted to know the details and figure out what she could and couldn't say before sending Queen Mystic feedback. Regardless, it seems like the matter has been resolved. The Admiral of Stars exhaled and sat by the window in peace as she took in the blue sky. In the periphery of a primitive forest on Sonia Island, Alger Wilson stood on a thin tree branch, looking at the port and the blue skies not far away. The strong winds around him swirled without dispersing as they affected the trees nearby. As the illusory grayish-white fog appeared, Alger was first delighted before he felt a little terrified. Mr. Fool only responded after quite some time. This means that his previous state was indeed a little abnormal. However, he has already recovered. He didn't respond to my lone request regarding the sun's unshadowed crucifix. He discovered my test and discovered a hint of my hidden thoughts. I can't do such things again in the future. Mr. Fool has only issued a simple warning this time. He might punish me directly next time. Thou shalt not test God. Thou shalt not test God. As his thoughts raced, Alger lowered his head and piously said, "Thank you for your kindness and forgiveness." Backlund, inside the Hall family's luxurious villa. Mr. Fool didn't pass on my question to Mr. World. Is this because the tarot gathering will proceed as normal in the afternoon, and there will be time for us to communicate? Audrey realized certain problems from the delay in the response. Generally speaking, Mr. Fool's reply is very timely. It was more than 15 minutes this time. He was handling other matters, very important matters. Is it related to George III's death? Regardless, a 15-minute delay wasn't too serious a problem. Audrey quickly retracted her thoughts and felt much better. I'll know the truth from Mr. World later. I hope that this incident won't have any more serious consequences, other than a full-scale war. At the moment, war is already unavoidable. Northborough in Backlund. Beneath St. Samuel Cathedral. Mr. Fool didn't say that he would help me. Emlyn White held a cup of red liquid and frowned slightly. He then interpreted the symbolic meaning of the response from another angle. Mr. Fool specifically emphasized that the tarot gathering will proceed as normal in the afternoon. He wants to tell me that the opportunity to escape from the predicament lies with a member? Could it be the star? In short, I should be able to leave this week. Emlyn had been taken into protective custody and kept behind St. Samuel Church's Cheney's Gate, so no matter what happened in the outskirts of Backlund, it was unlikely for it to affect him. Furthermore, it was impossible for him to suddenly escape from prison and head to places like the Blood Emperor ruins. Therefore, when Klein hinted to the other members last week, he hadn't been involved. In the Berg household in the City of Silver. Upon hearing Mr. Fool's response, Derek jumped up from bed. The excitement from his face was overflowing. Mr. Fool hasn't disappeared. Mr. Fool hasn't forsaken the City of Silver like the Creator did. He paced back and forth a few times, feeling the urge to immediately rush out of the room and head to the Twin Towers where he could tell the chief the good news. However, having had more than a year to mature, those experiences had left a clear mark on him. Finally, he calmed down and decided to attend the tarot gathering and obtain the promise of receiving the blessings before he sought the chief again. Perhaps, the lack of response during this period of time was a test of me, the chief, and the City of Silver, one set by Mr. Fool. He wanted to see if we would rapidly lean towards the fallen Creator. It was unknown when Derek's thought processes had a hint of the Hanged Man's colorful thoughts. Of course, he didn't have any other thoughts because of this. From what he knew, it was very normal for deities to test their believers. Back then, the Creator had left behind many similar legends. Despite being done with his contemplation, Derek still couldn't sit still. and he continued pacing back and forth in his room. He had never felt such anticipation towards the tarot gathering in that afternoon. In the City of Silver, in the forsaken land of the gods, that afternoon was a relatively abstract concept. As there weren't enough labels to confirm the time, they could only use the frequency of the lightning to define day and night, without going into any finer details. Backlund East Borough, inside a 2-bedroom rental apartment. Ha! After receiving Mr. Fool's response, Furs couldn't help but laugh out loud. As a best-selling author, she had a rich imagination. Before Mr. Fool responded, she had already come up with one terrifying story after another. Mr. Fool had exchanged his death for George III's failure. Mr. Fool's ploy was discovered by the deities and was besieged. Mr. Fool's old injuries relapsed and he fell into a deep sleep. Without his blessings, the world Gehrman Sparrow was being pursued by his enemies. These stories didn't develop in the same way, but the end was very similar. Furs would once again succumb to the full moon's ravings, eventually losing control and becoming a monster. Phew. Furs exhaled and said to Zio with a beaming smile, I just realized today that Mr. Fool is the most important man in my heart. Him. More importantly, you have to become a demigod as soon as possible and completely escape the curse of the full moon, Zio replied seriously. After joining the tarot club, she had learned of her friend's true situation. Yeah. Furs nodded and said with a smile, in short, I need to drink a glass of wine to celebrate. Above the grey fog, inside Sapphira Castle. After calming down, Klein used cogitation to restore his spirit-body state. When I first learned cogitation, I was required to imagine something that doesn't exist in this world so as to replace what's on my mind. That way, I can truly enter cogitation. At that time, my first reaction was to outline an intercontinental missile from Earth, but I didn't succeed. Heh, I didn't think too much about it back then. Now, in hindsight, this might have already spelled certain problems. It's not something that doesn't exist in the world, but one that has been snuffed out in the fog of history. Klein rubbed his temples and naturally recalled a matter of the past. He immediately focused his mind and planned on obtaining the Miracle Invoker Potion formula before the Tarot Club. At that moment, Amon was patiently guarding the spot where he had died. He could only stay in Sapphira Castle, so there was nothing else he could do. After some consideration, he grasped towards the exterior of the ancient palace and pulled an item from the grey fog's historical void. It was a black notebook bound with a hard paper cover. Paper. The Antigonus family's notebook. Sure enough. It's not a manifestation of the uniqueness. It's just that there are some powers left behind by the half-fool of the Antigonus family. Klein sighed and threw the notebook onto the long bronze table in front of him. This was because the content of the notebook might be problematic. He didn't intend to decipher the formula of the sequence 2 Miracle Invoker through it. He was only using it as a medium for divination. Following that, Klein conjured a pen and paper and wrote a divination statement, the original owner of this notebook. Putting down the pen, he picked up the paper and notebook, leaned back in his chair, and repeated the words he had just written. After repeating it 7 times, he entered a hazy dream. He saw a mountain peak that reached into the clouds. At the top of the mountain, there was a dilapidated towering palace that was separated from reality. In the palace, there were many places covered with moss and weeds. At the very end of the hall was a huge stone chair. Its surface was inlaid with dull gemstones and gold. In the middle, countless transparent maggots were huddled into a cluster as they slowly squirmed and grew, extending out like slippery tentacles covered in patterns. Unlike before, this time, Klein saw the monster directly and clearly saw his actual appearance. The palace above the grey fog suddenly began to shake violently, and Klein's figure was hoisted up in midair. In the next second, his spirit body collapsed into numerous squirming worms of spirit that crawled all over the ground. Sapphira Castle immediately quaked, and everything returned to its original state. Klein's spirit body took form once again. He sat at the fool's seat and rubbed his temples before saying with a wry smile, "It really is the half-fool with the uniqueness." After he muttered to himself, Klein did a slight recollection before picking up the pen and began to write down the knowledge he had obtained from prying into the secrets of the mythical creature. Sequence 2, Miracle Invoker, Main Ingredients. 1 heart of the dark demonic wolf or the Beyonder characteristic of another miracle invoker. Supplementary ingredients, 300 milliliters of dark demonic wolf's blood, 1 worm of time, 1 worm of star. Advancement ritual, return a piece of history that has been left behind to the present era. Chapter 1171. The third one, let a piece of history that has been left behind return to the present era. Return, not reappear. The meaning of the two are completely different. It's not sufficient for me to write the true history of the fourth or third epoch and disseminate it to complete the ritual. Klein's right hand, which was holding the fountain pen, paused. He instinctively analyzed the contents of the miracle invoker potion. After some thought, he found something that perfectly matched the ritual's requirements. That was to let the people of the City of Silver escape the forsaken land of the gods and return to the northern and southern continents, allowing this history that had been left behind for 2,000 to 3,000 years return to the present era. This isn't any easier than escaping Amon's pursuit. The only way to leave the forsaken land of the gods is to enter the giant king's court and open the palace where Dark Angel Sasrer is in deep slumber. This is the ancient sun god's negative personality. It's ranked first among the kings of angels and is known as the left hand of God, the deputy of heaven. He might even be stronger than the current Amon. Besides, his current state is being watched by the various deities. Yes, the more controllable aspect of this compared to my escape from Amon is that I can make sufficient preparations. Klein slowly exhaled and felt that there was a certain chance of completing the ritual. In fact, he knew very well that, even without him, the City of Silver would make repeated attempts to open the door to the giant king's residence and find a way to leave this forsaken land. It was as if they were moths darting towards the flames, even at the cost of death. No matter what, with my participation, the chances of success will definitely be higher than what it is now. Klein subconsciously wanted to open the door to the Dark Angel's slumber ground to attract Amon, creating chaos to offset the damage caused by the Dark Angel's awakening. This was a tactic he was rather familiar with. However, he eventually rejected this idea because it was too dangerous. After spending some time with Amon and finally seeing the level of a king of angels, Klein instinctively began to fear these terrifying existences. He no longer wanted to use the conflict between them to create chaos. Just their existence alone could cause irreparable damage to the surrounding Beyonders and the entire region. Under such circumstances, trying to rely on them to create a chaotic situation was no longer tottering on the edge of the abyss. If one wasn't careful, they would fall into the abyss and into eternal damnation. Therefore, it was best not to try. Unless he had no other solution, to the point of escaping being just his wishful thinking, Klein didn't want to make such an attempt. Indeed, a portion of a miracle invoker's Beyonder powers comes from history, which is why there's a ritual requirement like this. How did the other scholars of your complete it? Looking at the parchment on the long bronze table, he thought of a possible solution from another angle. If it were me, the only solution I can think of is to isolate some people or history from reality. Only when they are forgotten will I allow them to return to the present era. This might take centuries, or even longer. What an evil act. Heh, it reminds me of the peach blossom spring. Those people living in utopia away from the outside world share some characteristics. After some thought, Klein believed that the difficulty of this ritual for scholars of yore was whether they could survive until the ritual was held. Furthermore, there were too many accidents that could interrupt self-isolation like that. The forsaken land of the gods has perfectly resolved these issues, but it also brings with it greater problems. Dark Angel Sasrer. What is the condition of this heaven's deputy right hand now? Is it related to the resurrection of the ancient sun god? The level involved in such a matter has already reached the ceiling of this world. Why am I always involved in such matters? Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. He could roughly guess that this was due to the destiny Sapphira Castle brought him. After all, blasphemer Amon was unwilling to shoulder such a destiny. Retracting his wandering thoughts, he focused his attention back onto the miracle invoker potion formula. The Worm of Star is from the Apprentice Pathway. The supplementary ingredients contain 3 high-grade spiritual materials of the 3 neighboring pathways. I've already made the Worms of Time into Fate Siphon Charms. There's no way to restore them. Let Leonard's grandpa lend me another one. How can that be called lending? I'm going to use the upgraded version of a yesterday once more charm to exchange for it. Where should I find the Worm of Star? There aren't many demigods from the Apprentice Pathway that live in the real world. The Aurora Order Saint of Secrets, Bodhi's? However, I'm stuck in the forsaken land of the gods and can't deal with him. All I can do is ask Ma'am Hermit and Queen Mystic for help. At the same time, I have to urge Miss Magician to become a traveler as soon as possible. Yes, I can also get her to ask her teacher where Worms of Cosmos might be. There's actually only one main ingredient. It's either the heart of the dark demonic wolf or the Beyonder characteristic produced by other miracle invokers. It's no longer 2 as 1. Yes, that also means that, at this level, there are very few scattered characteristics. They've all gathered. The dark demonic wolf is also known as the god of wishes. That's a standard angel, a subsidiary god. If I can't find any materials that can be used, wouldn't I be slaying a god? The level of an angel can already be considered a hidden existence. There's a fundamental difference from being a sequence 3. Just thinking about it makes me scared. After making a list of helpers that he could rope in, he felt a lot more at ease. He had a feeling that he no longer feared his debts when they reached a significant amount. He lifted his right hand that was holding the fountain pen, and he continued to record what he had previously learned. Most of this was something he already knew, and he could only use it as a reminder. Finally, he wrote down incomplete information in the corner of the parchment. Sequence 1, Attendant of Mysteries, Main Ingredients, 1 Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder Characteristic. This piece of information meant that Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics were difficult to obtain through other means, with only 3 to choose from. One of them is on the half-fool on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range. It's with the uniqueness. The other is with Zeradal. There's still one more. According to what Leonard said, the true creator has clues to its location. Where could it be? Yes, Little Sun and the rest had hunted shapeshifters in the northern city ruins, Noise. There seems to be a high-level existence of the seer pathway lurking there. I wonder if it corresponds to Miracle Invoker or Attendant of Mysteries. Klein gradually had a thought, and he planned on visiting Noise for a preliminary investigation after he resurrected and escaped Amon. After digesting the knowledge he had gained, he summoned his golden pocket watch from the junk pile and opened it to check the time. Before he destroyed the Blood Emperor's ruin, he had sacrificed many things that he didn't need in battle, above the gray fog to prevent any damage. Despite that, he still lost quite a bit after the battle and his eventual suicide. Furthermore, they were all extremely valuable. Just the thought of it made him almost lose control. Grozel's Travels, Death Knell, Creeping Hunger, Fate Siphon Charm, Flaring Sun Charms, Marionette Konas and his equipment, Marionette Inuni and his 2 rings, and the Adventurer's Harmonica. No, I can't think about it anymore. Thankfully, I had thrown Azek's copper whistle above the gray fog ahead of time. Thankfully, I can still summon the historical void projections of these items. They're just accompanying me in a different form. Probably not for Grozel's Travels. Klein's temples throbbed as he couldn't help but feel heavy. He sighed and seriously mourned over the items, especially the mystical item that had accompanied him for a long time, Creeping Hunger. After a long silence, Klein forced his attention back to the present. As he waited for the tarot gathering to begin, he casually thought about the ancient sun god and the other matters such as Chernobyl. Suddenly, he frowned slightly. Since this is my hometown, there have never been transmigrators. They're all ancient humans that were released by Sapphira Castle. Then, do places like the Chaos Sea also have similar existences? Was Chernobyl converted into a sanctuary? According to what Amon said, and what I saw in my divination, the ancient sun god had indeed woken up in Chernobyl. Then, is he a transmigrator released from Sapphira Castle, or a survivor of a sanctuary? If it's the latter, who's the third person inside the cocoon? Upon thinking of this, Klein was alarmed as his pupils dilated slightly. He already had a certain guess about the history of the elves. It likely had nothing to do with Sapphira Castle. This way, he still couldn't find the correct corresponding identity of the third, or more correctly, the first, transmigrator. This transmigrator didn't seem to leave behind any traces in history. Without any hesitation, Klein's consciousness sank into the grayish-white fog. With the power of Sapphira Castle, he came directly to a certain part of history that was relatively distant. It was made up of many fragments of light, and the clearest one was the suspended Zhou Mingrue above the door of light. And beside Zhou Mingrue, the corresponding fog of history was instantly lit up due to his sufficient knowledge of Roselle. He saw a young man who also had his eyes tightly shut in the cocoon. There was no need to verify it. Through that sense of familiarity and spiritual intuition, he confirmed that this was the former incarnation of Emperor Roselle Gustav, Huang Tao. Without bothering to appreciate the emperor's true appearance, Klein turned his gaze to the other side. There was a transparent cocoon there, and the figure inside could vaguely be seen. As he had already seen the other hanged figures, he had lit up many fragments of light in the fog of history. They interweaved and stimulated each other, barely allowing him to see the fuzzy area. The figure inside was obviously a woman. Female. A thought came to his mind as he realized that he had missed a direction when he analyzed that transmigrator. Transmigrators had an objective mindset. They could completely control themselves and not leave any traces that exceeded the times, but there was one thing that couldn't be avoided. It was very obvious that Sapphira Castle was related to the three pathways related to the seer, apprentice, and marauder. After the birth of a transmigrator, they had to quickly make a connection with one of these three pathways. Not only was Klein involved in the case brought about by the Antigonus family's notebook, but he also quickly had the opportunity to choose the seer potion. In Intis, where Roselle was active, there was the secret order, and he got to know Zeradal early on. According to this logic, the ancient sun god with the marauder authority was indeed one of the reasonable suspects. Klein immediately conjured a pen and paper and began listing the corresponding names he knew at the moment. For example, fourth epic people from the Antigonus, Zeradal, and Abraham family, or the kings of angels surrounding the ancient sun god. Before long, Klein's gaze stopped on a few names. The first person was none other than the ancient god, Phlegria, who clearly had the authority of seer. Behind him was his subsidiary god. The god of the dead, Salinger, and the goddess of misfortune, Ammonises. The latter was also known as the Evernight goddess. Chapter 1172, Unperturbed, Biyao. Klein stared at the parchment in front of him for a long time without moving. After a while, he gently tapped the edge of the long model table, causing all the items that he conjured to disappear. He summoned his golden pocket watch and opened it to take a look. He sent a message to Little Sun, informing him to prepare to participate in the tarot gathering. About 1,000 heartbeats later, dark red beams of light rose from the two sides of the long bronze table, condensing into different figures on different high-backed chairs. Without any gaps in time, all the members of the tarot club looked at the figure sitting at the very end, who was shrouded in gray fog. Seeing that Mr. Fool wasn't wearing a monocle, Leonard inwardly heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he turned around and looked at the bottom of the long, modeled table to confirm the situation of the world. Klein Moretti. Similar to him, Catlia, Audrey, and Furs instinctively turned their attention to the world Gehrman Sparrow after seeing Mr. Fool. One of them knew that the world was in a dangerous situation and could only seek Mr. Fool's blessings. Another had failed to receive any feedback for 2 days, and she suspected that Gehrman Sparrow had really been embroiled in the matter regarding George III, with something definitely having happened during that time. The final one knew that George III's matter was extremely risky, and was a little worried that Mr. World would suffer serious injuries. Seeing that the world Gehrman Sparrow was perfectly fine without any abnormalities, Audrey retracted her gaze, curtsied, and bowed towards the end of the long bronze table. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. With the world situation becoming even more chaotic, she felt a little comforted by the fact that the Tarot Club could still maintain its original state. This significantly improved her mood. After the Tarot Club members bowed under Miss Justice's lead, the Fool Klein nodded slightly, indicating for everyone to sit down. Then, he slowly surveyed the area and smiled. It seems all of you were very concerned whether today's tarot gathering would proceed as usual. Upon hearing this, Alger's heartbeat sped up as he heard thumping sounds. Without a doubt, he believed that Mr. Fool was referring to him, and was giving him a gentle punishment. In other words, he had given him a chance to repent. Alger lowered his head and said with a trembling voice, "We weren't pious enough and thought too much." Why is Mr. Hanged Man apologizing on my behalf?" Furs, who had instructed Zio to ask Mr. Fool if the tarot gathering would proceed as scheduled, was stunned for a moment before she gave up on thinking. She then turned to the end of the long bronze table and lowered her head. She repeated, "We weren't pious enough and thought too much. So I wasn't the only one who prayed to Mr. Fool over the past few days. Mr. Hanged Man claims to have overthought things because there was a possibility that the tarot gathering would be cancelled, causing him to have some unnecessary speculations. But Furs shouldn't have thought of that." Audrey looked across the table and then to her sides, feeling enlightened. The Fool nodded and looked around again. Such concern is considered normal. He laughed and sighed. "I've recently used the world's body to play a game with Amon in the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Thankfully, we didn't have to skip this tarot gathering. Everything he said was the truth, but what the others would decipher from this information was definitely far from the actual situation. And this way, even if the news of the World Gehrman Sparrow being equal to the Fool was released, the members of the Tarot Club would only sneer in their hearts that Amon was trying his deceitful tricks again. To have a period of time that the world was equal to the Fool didn't necessarily mean that the world was always equal to the Fool. A portion of the truth was also a lie. Played a game with Amon. Old Man's guess was right. Mr. Fool was deliberately using Klein to bait blasphemer Amon. From the looks of it, he had obtained a rather satisfactory outcome, allowing Amon to suffer a terrible loss. Leonard, who had long come up with speculations, felt that this was completely in line with his expectations and didn't doubt Mr. Fool's words at all. Mr. Fool didn't reply for 15 minutes because he was in a critical moment battling Amon. He has already recovered to such a state. Audrey was pleasantly surprised and shocked when she heard that. For some reason, she felt a strong sense of honor. Alger could also tell from Mr. Fool's words that he had taken another step towards his recovery. He was actually able to hold the upper hand against a king of angels. This made him even more frustrated at himself for having doubts and testing the Fool. Mr. Fool had hinted in advance that the tarot gathering might be cancelled because he had long predicted that there would be a conflict between him and Amon. In fact, it's even possible that he had taken the initiative to create this episode by setting up a trap for Amon. Alger instantly made many connections and felt that there was no way he could hide his thoughts in front of such a high-level existence. He warned himself once again, "I can't do such things again." So Mr. World didn't provide any feedback because his body was being used by Mr. Fool to resist Amon. That king of angels, Amon, is truly powerful. Mr. Fool actually needed to personally take action. Furs and Zio exchanged looks, not having any more doubts about their previous questions. Katlia roughly understood the reason why the world had disappeared. She also guessed that the messenger who had the contractual ties with the world likely wasn't able to enter the Forsaken Land of the Gods. At the same time, she was surprised by the appearance of a king of angels appearing on stage in the present times. She felt that this was one of the signs of the apocalypse. Emlyn wasn't aware of what happened recently. He merely looked at everyone with a somewhat blank look. For some baffling reason, he felt that he had been locked behind Cheney's gate for far more than a week or two. Perhaps it had been a month or two, to the point that he felt like he no longer had a grasp over the current situation. Mr. World has come to the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Did Mr. Fool use his body to engage in a battle with that terrifying Amon? Derek was first alarmed before he felt a strong sense of joy. This meant that the City of Silver's next exploration would receive tremendous help. He immediately looked towards the end of the long bronze table, and he blurted out, "Honorable Mr. Fool, the chief wishes to receive your blessings for a ritual. Are you agreeable to such a request?" Having long learned of this from his prayers, Klein nodded slightly and said, "Sure." After receiving his promise, Derek couldn't help but smile. For a moment, he didn't know how to express his gratitude. 2 seconds later, he lowered his head and said loudly, "My faith lies only with Mr. Fool." The fool nodded and turned to look at Ma'am Hermit. He warmly said, "What questions do you have this time?" The Queen didn't say anything in her letter." Katlia was taken aback as she decided to first ask something she wanted to know. After all, she could still ask several questions. She deliberated for 2 seconds before saying, "Honorable Mr. Fool, what's the truth behind George III's death?" The moment the hermit said that, Justice Audrey and company immediately focused their attention. This was exactly what they wanted to know. Amongst them, the star Leonard had a certain level of understanding over the matter. He was more concerned about the deeper reason behind this incident. And among the members of the Tarot Club, the only one who was more confused about the situation was Emlyn. His mind was filled with thoughts like, what, and what happened? He hadn't even read the newspapers recently, so he didn't know that King George III had been assassinated. As for the son, although he wasn't sure why George III died for no reason, he didn't care at all. The fool Klein smiled and said calmly, "George III wanted to become the Black Emperor. And for this reason, he dug up the Tudor ruins, engaged in human trafficking, and created the Great Smog of Backland. He initiated a war, allowing the Fasak airships to bombard Backland. Unfortunately, he failed at the final ritual, and the secret mausoleum he needed for the ritual was destroyed." He briefly described the entire incident in the calmest tone he could make, doing so without mentioning what he had done. It would be beneath Mr. Fool to explain the situation on his own accord. The Great Smog of Backland. The airship raid. This was all done by George III to become a god. Audrey's eyes widened as she instantly recalled the two things she had experienced before. Suddenly, she understood why the World Gehrman Sparrow wanted to stop George III from becoming a god. She knew that he was a gentle and kind gentleman, and he would definitely not allow the culprit behind these two tragic cases to go scot-free. "If it were me, I would also have thought of doing so, but I would hesitate and be stopped by the possibility of ill developments. As for Mr. World, he is firm and decisive. This is a matter that involves the deities. Yes, there should also be the will of Mr. Fool in this matter." Audrey glanced at the World Gehrman Sparrow, who was sitting silently at the other end of the long, model table. She nodded slightly to express her agreement. Black Emperor. George III wished to become a god? This. Yes, Mr. Fool has the Black Emperor card of blasphemy. Gehrman Sparrow was previously investigating the matter of the Great Smog and human trafficking. Indeed, all of these are connected together. There was actually such a secret hidden behind it. From the looks of it, Mr. Fool's goal has been achieved. His plan has succeeded. Therefore, he has taken one more step towards his recovery. He can now face off with the King of Angels head-on. The more Alger thought about it, the more fearful and spirited he became. He felt that, despite knowing of some clues ahead of time, he was completely unaware of Mr. Fool's setup. Amidst the shock experienced by Leonard, Furs, and the other members of the Tarot Club, Katlia, who already had a premonition, suppressed her emotions and decided to ask another question. "Honorable Mr. Fool, what's the attitude of the 7 deities regarding this matter?" Chapter 1173 Advice/Be a Good Question. The fool Klein inwardly praised her, and he explained by using the Red Angel Evil Spirit's explanation in his own words. The 7 deities wish to have a Black Emperor, but they are not unanimous in their candidate for the Black Emperor. When George III successfully obtained the ticket to becoming one through secret preparations, the 7 deities had no choice but to accept it, regardless of whether they approved of him or not. So that's the situation. Apart from the moon Emlyn and the sun Derek, the other members of the Tarot Club were enlightened. They roughly understood why the churches acted in a rather contradictory manner when faced with the tragedies of the Great Smog of Backlund, the deaths caused by the Phaeacian air raid, and George III's assassination. Following that, they suddenly had a question. Since George III had already made preparations and had reached the final step of carrying out the ritual while obtaining the tacit approval of the 7 deities, why would he fail? They immediately thought of an answer: because Mr. Fool didn't agree to it. In the destruction of George III's Black Emperor ritual, the churches probably didn't do anything to stop it. Perhaps, they even provided some help to Mr. Fool's subordinates. Did the Church of the Lord of Storms make use of this chaos to secretly do something? No, they likely wouldn't conceal it too much. Leonard recalled all the details he had previously discovered, and he was confident of his grasp over the overall situation. The 7 deities' tacit approval. Mr. Fool vetoed it and sent the world and other blessed to secretly destroy George III's apotheosis ritual. But what has this got to do with the Queen? Why did she discover that Gehrman Sparrow has gone missing? Black Emperor. The Queen might have participated in the operation led by Mr. Fool, and later, discovered that a participant had gone missing. Katlia made a guess at the truth through her rich knowledge and insight. And at this moment, Emlyn had just managed to make heads and tails of the discussions that had just been discussed, and he managed to understand the developments outside during his time in protective custody. George III had secretly plotted to become a god and received the 7 deities' tacit approval. In the end, Mr. Fool's blessed destroyed his ritual, causing him to die on the spot. Seeing that everyone was silent, the Fool Klein looked at the hermit Katlia and said, "Any other questions?" "There's nothing else this time." Katlia bowed her head even lower. She was more respectful than before towards the mighty figure at the end of the long bronze table. Although she had long known that Mr. Fool had the Snake of Fate, Death Council, an ancient bane under him, and was in secret control of the life school of thought, she still never expected that the powers Mr. Fool could mobilize in the real world were able to destroy a king's apotheosis ritual. Furthermore, he had foiled the plot of a king of angels, the son of the Creator. Mr. Fool's hidden forces are more exaggerated than I imagined. What effect do the members of the Tarot Club exert on him? A backing faction? Individual growth? Or is it just a backup plan? Katlia instantly thought of many things and momentarily forgot that she was already a Sequence 4 demigod. No matter which organization she was in, she was considered a member of the upper echelons. Just the feats displayed by Mr. Fool is enough to make a saint lack confidence. Justice Audrey only took a glance at Ma'am Hermit before she interpreted her mental state. At this moment, the Fool Klein nodded. "You may begin." Upon hearing this, Leonard immediately turned to the other end of the long, mottled table and said to the world, "How's your situation now?" Furs, Zio, Audrey, and the other members of the Tarot Club also cast their gazes over, expressing their concern for the world Gehrman Sparrow's situation. From their point of view, Mr. World, who was stuck between Mr. Fool and Angel of Time Amon as a combat tool, was probably in a bad situation. His survival meant that he was already considered lucky enough. Feeling the varied concern, Klein controlled the world and chuckled hoarsely. "Not too bad, but not too good either. It's all thanks to Mr. Fool's grace that I finally obtained a secret from Amon, but I haven't completely escaped from his grasp." Without waiting for everyone to respond, he continued, "I'm currently in a rather sticky situation. I relied on Mr. Fool's powers to enter a certain concealed state and temporarily extricate myself from Amon's grasp. However, if I were to dispel this state and return to the real world, I'll only find myself back where my body is. And it's very likely that Amon is still loitering nearby. I would like to make an attempt at finding a solution. I wonder what your opinions are regarding this matter?" The meaning behind the world Gehrman Sparrow's words was very clear. He wanted to rely on himself first, leaving Mr. Fool's help as a last resort. And his actual meaning was essentially the same: find a way to bypass the restrictions first. And in the case that his solution didn't really work, then he would consider living in the state of being undead. Solution? Alger and company were suddenly a little excited because the suggestions they provided would be used to fight against a king of angels. If they were employed and were of use, then this would be a proud moment in their life, one that would remain for the rest of their lives. Audrey was just about to speak in excitement when she retracted her words. This was because she knew that she couldn't give random suggestions, otherwise, it could lead to Mr. World getting caught by Amon. Xiao thought about it seriously and realized that she couldn't come up with any useful suggestions. She could only choose to observe and learn. Must it be where your body originally was? Do you have any blood or hair that was kept elsewhere? Alger thought for a moment and gave a suggestion using a question. The fool Klein thought for a moment and made the world shake his head. No. Compared to his original body, a single tube of blood was too little. Thinking of this, Klein suddenly had an idea. Perhaps he could use those 2 tubes of blood as ingredients, combining them with other methods, using alchemical life to create a new body. There are 2 problems. Firstly, alchemical life requires the spirit body's involvement, otherwise, the final product might not be considered my body. Secondly, I don't know any demigods who can complete alchemical life. The only one barely related to them is Frank Lee. Will I end up becoming a mushroom man? Then, I'd be better off as an undead. As Klein thought about it, he nearly shivered. After the hanged man's suggestion was rejected, the hermit Katlia set off from her knowledge of mysticism. She deliberated and asked, "Do you have a Sequence 3 sealed artifact?" "Why do you ask?" The world asked. A Sequence 3 sealed artifact can respond to prayers within a certain range. You can make use of that, Katlia explained simply. Klein roughly understood what Ma'am Hermit was thinking. You're talking about descent? That's right. Get someone to set up a descent ritual at the periphery, and you should be able to respond to it in your own concealed state. Katlia first glanced at the sun and described the specific plan. Then, she realized something as she asked, "Do you really have a Sequence 3 sealed artifact?" She originally wanted the world to seek Mr. Fool's bestowment. "I'm already a Sequence 3 Beyonder," Klein replied simply as he controlled the world. The members of the Tarot Club were momentarily speechless. They knew very well that Mr. World must have advanced to Sequence 4 at the end of June to become a demigod. And now, it was December of the same year. The Queen once said that using the blood of the Snake of Fate to advance would make it easier for me to become a Sequence 3 clairvoyant than others. Besides, the Tarot Club has given me plenty of precious mysticism knowledge. It has greatly helped me digest the potion. But even so, I still need another half a year before I have a chance of attempting to reach Sequence 3. The hermit Katlia subconsciously looked around and discovered that the other members wore stupefied and envious looks. She sighed silently and said, "Is my suggestion useful, Mr. World?" The World Gehrman Sparrow shook his head. There is a huge restriction when responding in that state. Once he chose to descend, it would mean that he would begin the rest of his life, no, afterlife, as an undead. Perhaps, I can combine the 2 methods. Yes, I can use the method of praying to the Fool, sea god, or protector of magic and drama performers to leave the forsaken land of the gods, but that's not urgent. It's too easy to reveal the truth. The Fool Klein made the world look at the star Leonard while in thought. Leonard instantly understood what he meant. He tersely acknowledged. "I'll go back and do some research to see if there are any other ideas." Clearly, his true intention was to ask Old Man when he was back. He was an angel who knew Amon rather well. Perhaps, he could come up with suggestions that no one else could think of. This was the answer that Klein wanted. He immediately made the world say, "Okay." After the discussion of how to escape his predicament came to an end, the World Gehrman Sparrow looked at Furs. "Help me ask the Abraham family if they still have any worms of cosmos that have yet to lose their spirituality. If there are, what will be the price for the exchange?" A worm of star was a high-level spiritual material. Most of the time, it didn't contain any Beyonder characteristics. Therefore, their spirituality would suffer an irreversible loss. Without any special methods, it would be difficult to preserve it for too long. Worms of Cosmos. Furs was taken aback before she nodded. All right. After receiving an answer, Klein made the world cast his gaze at the hermit Catlia. If Miss Magician isn't able to exchange for a worm of star from the Abraham family, I would like to entrust you with a mission. What mission? Catlia asked with interest. The world said with a smile, hunt the Aurora Order's Saint of Secrets, Bodhi's. Chapter 1174 Joint Operation The Aurora Order's Saint of Secrets, Bodhi's. Mr. World wants to hunt him? Furz's first reaction was that she had heard wrongly. After all, Gehrman Sparrow had no connection to the Saint of Secrets. However, she quickly had a rough idea from the Worm of Star that had just been mentioned. This made her suddenly excited and thrilled. This was because she also wanted to hunt the Saint of Secrets, Bodhi's, to avenge her teacher's family. However, due to her lacking strength and the inability to pay for it, she had kept this thought to herself. Although it sounds like Mr. World doesn't plan on personally taking action, Ma'am Hermit is also a Sequence 4 demigod, and she has the support of that Queen Mystic behind her. I can provide the utmost support within my abilities. As her thoughts raced, Furs cast her gaze at the hermit beside her, waiting for her reply. After some thought, Catlia said, Bodhi's is very likely a saint of the apprentice pathway. It's very difficult to hunt him. Besides, he has the Rose Redemption backing him and the True Creator's protection. With my current level, it's almost impossible for me to complete this mission solely on my own. You can seek the help of Queen Mystic. I will also arrange for other partners for you. Klein made the world Gehrman Sparrow reply in a low and hoarse voice. The reward is the right to choose the spoils of war first, and mysticism knowledge that will allow you to digest the potion within this year. It's December. Catlia's heart palpitated when she heard that. She deliberated and said, when the time comes, I will try, but I cannot guarantee success. No matter how difficult the mission of hunting the Saint of Secrets was, it couldn't be as dangerous as accepting the knowledge injection process from the hidden sage. And as for the mysticism knowledge provided by the latter, they didn't necessarily aid in digestion. There was a high probability that it included mathematics, machinery, and literature. No problem. As long as you do it seriously, I'll still compensate you with the mysticism knowledge even if you fail in the end. The world nodded and confirmed the deal. At this moment, Furs finally couldn't help but speak out, Mr. World, Ma'am Hermit, can I join this mission? I might be able to provide some help. Even if you didn't, I would have gotten you too. The fool Klein secretly laughed and made the world nod gently. There's a spot reserved for you in this mission. Furs wasn't surprised at all. She asked curiously, what can I do? What do you need me to do? Gehrman Sparrow replied in an extremely calm tone, bait. Furs opened her mouth, momentarily at a loss for words. She had a feeling that she knew that this would happen. The world Gehrman Sparrow continued, similarly, you also have the right to choose the spoils of war. You'll be just after Ma'am Hermit. Also, during this period of time, I can help you record Beyonder powers like traveling. Furs had never expected a reward, as it was her greatest reward to be able to exact revenge successfully. In the future, she might even receive additional rewards from her teacher. Without any hesitation, she nodded and said, okay. The world immediately cast his gaze towards Miss Justice. How's the digestion of your Dreamwalker potion? Thanks to the expedition into Grozelle's travels and the persistence she had put into her acting, the speed at which she digested the potion was very fast. Her eyes darted around as she thought for a moment. I've already concluded the acting principles. In another 2 to 3 months, I should be able to completely digest it. It's a little slow. Klein mumbled inwardly as he made the world say, create more opportunities to act. If you can digest the potion before Ma'am Hermit attacks the Saint of Secrets, I can give you Vin Rambise's Beyonder characteristic ahead of time as payment so that you can join in on the operation. Klein believed that he would have to stay in the forsaken land of the gods for a very long time. Most of the matters in the outside world could only be interfered with through the members of the Tarot Club. It was also beneficial for him to increase their strength as soon as possible. Furthermore, he wasn't directly giving it to her. The difficulty of hunting the Saint of Secrets bodies was just as Katlia had said. It was rather difficult. All right. Audrey was just fretting over how she could accumulate more credit with Mr. World. Therefore, she naturally agreed without any hesitation when she heard his offer. In her heart, the members of the Aurora Order were lunatics and destructive maniacs. There was no need to find a reason to deal with them. In addition, Audrey had previously been troubled by her lack of experience as a Beyonder. This gave her a chance. Although it was rather dangerous, it was still an opportunity. Gehrman Sparrow sure is generous. To provide the knowledge that can help a mysticologist digest the potion and a sequence 4 demigod characteristic. This shouldn't only be for the Worm of Star. It sounds like a supplementary material. He's helping the members of the Tarot Club improve as quickly as possible according to Mr. Fool's will, so as to be effective in the future? Alger listened to the world's conversation with the other members and vaguely grasped a certain truth. This made him rather vexed. He suspected that if he hadn't lacked faith and had other thoughts, to the point of foolishly testing Mr. Fool, he might have already been assigned a mission that could aid him in pushing open the door of godhood. At that moment, Justice, who had agreed to the request, glanced at the magician and said with a faint smile, "I'm looking forward to the Abraham family not having any Worm of Star." "Me too." Furs nodded seriously, indicating that she had the same thoughts. Seeing that the world was done speaking, Katlia thought for a moment and said to Judgment, "Do you want to join this mission? Do some intelligence gathering on the periphery. Your ability in this area left a deep impression on me." Even without Ma'am Hermit's invitation, Zio wouldn't refuse in helping her friend. She nodded gently and said, "I don't have a problem if the operation is in Backlund. If it's somewhere else, my role would be greatly discounted." A sheriff and their own area of jurisdiction were always connected. The more familiar they were with the place, the better they could showcase their abilities. Once they exceeded that range, they could only rely on their Beyonder powers. Your reward is being third to choose the spoils of war. Katlia looked at the star once again. If there's a need, I hope you can allow the official factions to appear at the right moment. Leonard chuckled. I hope you don't have to go that far. My reward shall also be a spoil of war. If my dear poet friend here wasn't invited in the end, then the mission of hunting the Saint of Secrets would have nearly become a sorority for the female members of the Tarot Club. The fool Klein muttered inwardly as he made the World Gehrman Sparrow finalize the matter. All that was left was to wait for the Abraham family's feedback. Following that, Alger and Derek reached a rental arrangement for the unshadowed crucifix. Just as they entered the free exchange segment, Emlyn couldn't help but look towards the end of the long bronze table. Honorable Mr. Fool, can you give me a hint? How should I escape protective custody? The fool, who was shrouded in the gray fog, nodded slightly and said simply, "This week." His answer was said with great confidence, but it wasn't a prophecy, but a judgment of the situation. The current situation had Faysac and Intis attacking Lone, while Fainapotter was attacking Lone's allies, Lenberg, Mason, etc. The three churches definitely didn't wish to suffer any damage the Sanguine could bring while already having existing enemies. Therefore, Emlyn would be released very soon, but it was hard to say for Father Yutravsky. Similarly, the Sanguine's focus would definitely be shifted to the global situation. It was unlikely for them to have the motivation to continue probing Emlyn and his other partners. In addition, in the past 2 days, the one whose reason for praying was the most forced, apart from Zio, was Emlyn White. Klein suspected that he had been locked in the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral all this time because it was convenient for the goddess to exert her influence on him. Now that the matter had ended, he was no longer of any use. Combined with the three factors, it wasn't difficult to conclude that Emlyn would be free in no time. The only exception was that if this fellow had really been forgotten. Be it the Church of Evernight or the Sanguine, they had forgotten that there was such a fellow locked behind Cheney's gate. If that was the case, Klein would get the star Leonard to provide him with some assistance. Emlyn heaved a sigh of relief and sincerely thanked Mr. Fool. At the end of the free exchange, the world Gehrman Sparrow suddenly looked at the hanged man. You said that you've already arrived on Sonia Island and are inside the primitive forest? Yes, Alger replied in puzzlement. Gehrman Sparrow pondered for a moment. You can try to seek out an elven ruin. Perhaps you might chance upon some sort of opportunity. Alger suddenly thought of the Book of Calamity and the scenes he had seen in his dream. He nodded thoughtfully and said, "All right." After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering came to an end. Audrey and company stood up and bowed before leaving the world above the gray fog. After returning to his body, Leonard immediately lowered his voice and described Klein's predicament. Finally, he said, "Old man, do you have any good suggestions?" "My suggestion? I think it's better to ask the fool for help," Palaz Zoroast replied without any hesitation. Leonard coughed lightly and said, "Aren't you going to use this opportunity to make things difficult for Amon?" Chapter 1175 Ideas are very important. Making things difficult for Amon? Palaz Zoroast chuckled. What benefits can there be? Otherwise, forget it. Leonard was momentarily at a loss for words. After a few seconds, he said, "At least it can make you feel good." Palaz chuckled. "I will feel better if you don't bring this topic up." Without waiting for Leonard to respond, this sequence one angel from the Marauder pathway sighed with his slightly aged voice. "Doesn't your former colleague have a deceit charm? Perhaps he can use this to come up with a solution." After getting rid of the Amon avatars in Backlund, Palaz had given the godhood symbols and magic labels needed to make 4 charms: deceit, parasite, deprivation, and aging, to Leonard. Leonard had passed on this knowledge to Klein, and the latter had used the knowledge and the worms of time to create 1 deceit, parasite, and deprivation bullet each. Later on, he had used them to deal with Kona's Kilgore, but Leonard wasn't aware of this. Leonard whispered thoughtfully, "Old man, are you saying that by using the deceit charm, you can mislead Amon and cause him to misidentify the location, preventing him from influencing Klein's escape?" In his mind, Palaz Zoroast snapped back. "Do you think it's possible to use a deceit charm in front of a Marauder Pathway's King of Angels?" "It's impossible." Leonard laughed dryly and pressed in a thick-skinned manner. "What do you mean then?" Palaz Zoroast's voice suddenly sounded more spirited. "Deceive the rule that one can only return to where one's body is." "Deceive the rule? That works too?" Leonard asked in shock. Palaz gave a self-deprecating laugh and sighed. Compared to deceiving Amon, deceiving a rule is much easier. After all, underneath this world is madness and chaos. This sentence made Leonard speechless for a moment. On the one hand, he wasn't experienced enough. He didn't know that orders and laws could be deceived, and on the other hand, he never expected that, in Old Man's heart, Amon was even more terrifying than the laws of nature and the order of the world. After nearly 10 seconds, he spoke again. "With this method, how high is the possibility of success?" "It's very, very low," Palaz said with a sneer. "However, the probability of deceiving the order of the world like this with a deceit charm made from a worm of time from Amon's avatar is very, very low. Therefore, my suggestion is still to get him to make a request to the fool for help. Don't waste any more time. When fighting Amon, the longer the delay, the more dangerous it will be." Leonard pondered for a moment before nodding in agreement. "I understand. I'll also advise him to do so." Of course, he wouldn't forget mentioning the highly improbable method that Old Man had suggested. "It's good that you understand." Seriously, disturbing an old man's reading, as Palaz mumbled, his voice gradually lowered and disappeared from Leonard's mind. In 7 Pinster Street, the newspaper that was placed on the coffee table suddenly flew up and automatically spread open over the sofa. "Using a deceit charm to deceive the requirement that I can only resurrect ere my original body is?" Above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, Klein reconstructed Palaz Zoroast's suggestion, in his own words. As soon as he finished speaking, he recalled the animal hide lantern that kept burning. Amon had deceived the laws of nature, allowing the candle to remain in a magical state and continue burning for a week without needing any fuel. His eyes lit up as he whispered, "This line of thought is something only an angel from the Marauder pathway can think of immediately. It might not be impossible." Like Palez, he did feel that, compared to dealing with Amon, it was much easier to deal with the laws of nature. After seeing Hope, he immediately analyzed the possible outcome. Although I've already used the deceit bullet, I can summon it from the historical void. After all, before the effects end, I'll definitely reform my body and successfully resurrect. The laws of nature are truly pitiful. Not only will they be deceived, even the item used to deceive it is fake. The only problem is that the bullet might not be able to deceive the mysticism law. It was already a little difficult to deal with Kona's Kilgore back then. Amidst his thoughts, he slowly surveyed the area and gradually gained inspiration. That was to use Sapphira Castle. After gaining initial control of Sapphira Castle, he could already mobilize the power of a Sequence 2 angel here. And many of the things he had come into contact with previously had explained that the authority of Sapphira Castle had a high probability of spanning over the three pathways of Seer, Apprentice, and Marauder. It could generate a convergence effect on the corresponding Beyonders, and it had clearly attracted the attention of Amon. That was to say, Klein suspected that Sapphira Castle had the power of these three pathways at the same time. However, as a seer, most of the power he could stir was concentrated in this domain. With the help of the medium known as the Deceit Bullet, I might be able to stir the other powers of Sapphira Castle. Since I'm already capable of using some miracles in the seer domain, having power from the Marauder pathway at the angel level is a highly reasonable deduction. The only problem is that there must be a medium of a sufficient level. This way, I don't have to worry about not being able to deceive that rule. As his thoughts brightened up, he seriously began to formulate a plan. He used the mysticism laws as his target and attempted to formulate a scam. In order to reduce the difficulty, it's best to have additional preparations. I can't deceive something out of nothing, at least unless I'm Amon's true body. Yes. I'll bestow a tube of my blood to Little Sunday. I'll create a fake respawn point that exceeds the range. And then, using the deceit bullet as a trigger, stir the corresponding angel-level powers contained within Sapphira Castle, misdirecting that rule and making it view the fake respawn point as the real one, while the real one becomes the fake one. He outlined the details bit by bit, and when his thoughts finally took form, Klein immediately used the mysticism connection between himself and the spot he died, to observe the actual situation with his true vision. He saw that the grayish-yellow fog had thinned a lot, and the deep ravine that hid Chernobyl was no different from before. It was unknown where Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a monocle, had stolen a rock from and had placed it on the spot where Klein had passed away. He sat on it and patiently played with a human-skinned glove. He occasionally bent the human-skinned glove's finger and stretched it at other times, as if he could pass 100 years doing that. About a kilometer away, in a certain spot in the grayish-yellow fog, 3 almonds in black classical mage robes crouched around a rock as they seriously played poker cards that they had stolen from somewhere. From time to time, they would nudge their monocle. Elsewhere in this extensive moor, Amon would be either alone or in groups, strolling leisurely, writing in thought, or discussing all sorts of questions with one another. In the dark and dangerous forsaken land of the gods, it was such a harmonious scene. It would have been better if the young men weren't all the same, wearing classic black robes, pointed hats and monocles, with similar black hair, black eyes, broad foreheads, and thin faces. Just as Klein was about to make a further observation, the Amon sitting on the rock suddenly raised his head. He nudged his crystal-carved monocle and looked at him. Across the moor, all of the almonds looked up at the highest point of the fog of history. Klein immediately retracted his gaze and cut off the connection. In the City of Silver, Derek Berg arrived at the top of the spire and met Chief Colin Iliad. "Your Excellency, I've already received the promise of blessings," Derek said frankly and directly. With white hair and an old scar on his face, Colin Iliad was visibly relieved. He slowly nodded and said, "That's good. That's good." He had repeated the sentence in a rare instance. As an excellent demon hunter and the City of Silver's chief, he had always been patient, never taking unnecessary risks. Therefore, with the sudden lack of a response from the fool, he didn't immediately turn to the true creator, and he decided to wait patiently for another month. For the City of Silver, which had been waiting in the Dark Ages for more than 2,000 years, a month was something that could be accepted. Without waiting for Derek to reply, Demon Hunter Colin left the window and calmly said, "Head back first. I'm going to start preparing for the advancement ritual." Derek glanced at the chief and said sincerely, "You'll definitely succeed." He didn't stay any longer. He immediately left the spire and returned home. After setting up the ritual again and placing the 6 powerful corpses that he had hunted to the correct position, Colin Iliad began to concoct the potion. After all of this was done, the City of Silver chief closed his eyes and lowered his head, chanting in Jotun, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Above the gray fog, Klein saw ripples of light emanate as he heard a slightly illusory prayer. He immediately summoned a paper figurine and combined the power of Sapphira Castle with it. He threw it into the prayer circle and conveniently marked the City of Silver's chief. At the same time, with the help of this prayer circle, he observed the situation of the entire spire and the City of Silver. He confirmed that there was no sign of Amon's parasitic existence near the chief or Little Sunday. "I have to seize this opportunity." Klein immediately conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow and made him pose as he prayed. At this moment, Colin Iliad saw the light. In the holy light, a holy angel with 12 pairs of illusory wings suddenly descended. As clean, white feathers fluttered down, the demon hunter was embraced by these wings of light. This was a blessing from Mr. Fool. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.